I want to hear some kind of evidence that critical race theory or any version of critical theory has actually uplifted anybody who's oppressed.
It's like, how do you know, like, with a good level of certainty that what you're claiming around how you understand the Bible, how you understand salvation, is actually the way?
I don't understand how you can claim to be a Christian, anyone can claim to be a Christian, and say, well, I just don't even know if Jesus rose from the dead.
The whole point is none of us are talking from a God's eye point of view.
I'm just applying a critical theory or postmodern deconstructionist tactic to everything you just said or could say. Greetings, friends. Welcome back to the Shed and Beam. I am so excited to invite you into this episode, invite you into this conversation. You are going to have a lot of fun, even though it's a 2.5-hour video, the longest Shed and Beam video to date by a long shot. You're especially going to have a lot of fun if you're at all like me and you're just sick and tired of the online mudslinging, the sort of schoolyard bullying, calling strangers names online that you would never dare call them to their face, the hyper politicization and the hyper polarization of our society. If you're looking for intelligent conversations by trained scholars on the issues behind the issues that blow up our news feeds, you're going to have a blast in this episode. What I've done has gotten 3 progressive Christian thinkers to argue the case for critical theory and postmodernism. And on the other side, I've gotten 3 Christian scholars to take the counterpoint and say that on the whole, critical theory and postmodernity are actually more of a hindrance or harm to Christians seeking to make the world a better place. Now, I will forewarn you, the first 50 minutes or so, you're going to feel like, what did I enter when I stepped into the Shed and Beam here? There's some high-level academic rhetoric being thrown around, but I promise you, hang in there, especially through the intro statements. Things really start to get spicy, interesting, and yet all at the same time, civil, kind, and edifying. So if you want this kind of content, if you enjoy this kind of thing, please, it helps me out a ton if you take 5 seconds, subscribe to the channel so that you can get future content down the road. Step into the Shed and Beam, add a little meaning to your day. We're going to do what is all too rarely done these days, in these highly polarized days, in these us versus them tribalized days. We're going to have a conversation. We're going to have a conversation with people we disagree with. Imagine that. And we're going to have a conversation with people we disagree with, and we're going to disagree kindly. Imagine that. Well, we'll see. I mean, this thing could go off the rails real quick. But we're going to have a lot of fun today. I am joined by a few guests who I'm going to allow to quickly introduce themselves so that we aren't just talking heads on a screen. Then I'm going to give you sort of the topic, the main driving theme of the day. So take it away. Kevin, who are you?
So I'm Kevin Carnahan. I'm professor of philosophy and religion at Central Methodist University. I am the former co-editor of the Journal of the Society of Christian Ethics, former president of the Niebuhr Society, and I have a side gig now on social media, which started because I got on to watch my kids and what they were doing and ended up getting sucked in.
Nice. I love it. Well, it's good to have you, brother. Aaron, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, I'm Aaron Simmons. It's great to be here. I'm a professor of philosophy at Furman University in South Carolina and work primarily in philosophy of religion, but in the traditions of existentialism, phenomenology, and deconstruction, and do a lot of political philosophy as well. My last book was called Camping with Kierkegaard, which is written to a broad audience. I dedicated it to my son, wrote it on top of the mountains in Pisgah National Forest, and that's also led to a side gig on social media, so anybody that wants to connect with me on Substack at Philosophy in the Wild.
Right on. And best punk show you've ever been to?
Best punk
hit of any punk show you've ever been to?
I got to tell you, the recent MXPX show in Charlotte was absolutely fantastic. They've been going for now, nearly 30 years, maybe more.
Yeah.
And that place was sold out. I got to see my son crowd surf for the first time. He's 16 years old. Had an absolute great time. Ruined my knee while in the pit for a couple hours. So yeah, I'm too old to be there, it turns out.
That's awesome. I used to be in a terrible band that would open for them, and yeah, got a few bruises in MXPX pits over the years.
I went to
and
Neil Diamond back in the day. Does that count? Is that
no,
no?
that's
Okay.
no different
Good,
world.
good.
Okay, hashtag okay boomer.
Mhm.
Tim, tell us about yourself, man.
Yeah, my name is Tim Whitaker. I'm the founder of the New Evangelicals, a digital nonprofit now run by Melinda Hale. I used to be a conservative Christian, grew up deeply in the evangelical movement, did all of the things that you can imagine. I deconstructed. Now I'm a progressive Christian, and I do a lot of work under the moniker Tim Whitaker Speaks on YouTube, Substack, and Facebook and Instagram, helping expose Christian nationalism and how I believe it's the greatest threat to democracy today.
Awesome. Well, Tim and I, for those of you who have been paying attention, have gone back and forth on the interwebs for a couple months now. And so I'm really, really excited that we can actually get together and have a conversation. It's good to have you, brother. Corey, tell us about yourself.
So, Corey Miller, I taught philosophy comparative religions for a dozen years at Indiana University, but presently I am the president and CEO of Ratio Christi. It's a campus ministry on about 100 college campuses. And we have professors, divisions, undergrads, and we're kind of around the world. Interest in philosophy of religion, ethics. Dissertation was on Aristotle, Maimonides, and Aquinas. So you got some Levinas on there and Maimonides, a few years
There you
apart from Aaron, but interest nonetheless. If people wanted to contact me through drcorymiller.com.
Nice. And seventh generation Mormon, now ex-Mormon, right?
Yeah. So my ancestor was one of Joseph Smith's bodyguards, and he had 5 wives, 36 children, of which I'm a descendant. So my family says I come from healthy stock, and I'll take that, I guess.
Wow. Not a great bodyguard, because didn't Joseph Smith get shot?
No, I've had people say he wasn't doing his job very well.
Well, it's good to have you, brother. And Dr. Neil Shenvi, tell us about yourself.
Dr. Neil Shenvi, I have a PhD in theoretical chemistry, so not philosophy or critical social theory, but I got interested in those subjects about 9 years ago now. I've written 2 books, one Critical Dilemma and a new one out this January called Post Woke. So I spent a lot of time trying to understand critical social theories and their implications for Christianity. So I'm happy to be here.
Awesome. Very cool. Well, it's good to have you all. Our topic for the day, for the conversation, is going to be, are critical theory and postmodernism more of a hindrance or a help to Christians seeking to make the world a better place? That's sort of the assumption going into the conversation, is all 6 of us care deeply about justice, care deeply about the poor, care deeply about lifting people out of oppression, care deeply about what Christianity has to bring to brighten up an all too often dark world. And so the question is then, our critical theory and some of these definitions will come out over the course of the conversation, and postmodernism, helpful tools to us as we seek to better the world. And so on one side of that question, you'll find me, Neil, and Corey. On the other side of that question, you will find Tim, Kevin, and Aaron. And so I want to kick it to Tim, Kevin, Aaron. Launch into it, man. Wherever you guys want to go with this, build a case for us that critical theories and postmodernism are more of a help than a hindrance to Christians trying to better the world. Take it away.
All right. Well, I'll start us off just as a broad framing, and I should say, Corey, you mentioned that you're a 7th gen Mormon, ex-Mormon. I'm actually a 4th generation Pentecostal of the Church of God, Cleveland, Tennessee, and unlike Tim, have actually not deconstructed. It's not how I describe myself. Instead, it's because of my specialty in deconstructionism as a philosophical idea that I have, in my view, dug deeper into my own Pentecostal heritage and continue to stand there to this day. So there's a lot of variation even in how, the Kevin, Tim, and I understand kind of where we are and how to describe that. So let me give just a very quick 30,000 foot overview. And a lot of this is responding to interviews that I've heard Corey and Neil offer in different spaces. Thaddeus, a lot of your podcasts as well. So I've kind of framed this knowing that it's sort of hitting some of the claims that you all might take issue with. And so I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. So first, postmodernism should be understood as a general framework internal to which critical theory is just one particular methodology. And postmodernism, the best definition is from the Christian philosopher Meryl Westphal, who says you can't peek over God's shoulder. This is an epistemic commitment, not a metaphysical one. So postmodernism does not include any necessary metaphysical commitments. It is not a worldview. It is an epistemic awareness that then guides how we approach whatever we hold to be true. And that general awareness is something that I think Christianity actually deeply understands in its conception of seeing through a glass darkly, the idea that we would be located in our histories and our bodies and our perspectives and our experiences just seems to be something that Christians actually already understand, and postmodernism helps to give some language for that commitment. Now, then critical theory is for philosophers, and I know, Neil, you talked a lot about contemporary critical theory, which is a narrower version. I'm going to avoid that, at least initially, and say critical theory at its, again, 30,000-foot view is this broad methodological commitment that is allowing for a variety of worldviews. It is also not a worldview because internal to critical theory, especially first and second and third gen critical theorists, they radically disagree about what might count as Weltanschauungs that they then articulate internal to their metaphysics. So critical theory, and I went here to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy to find what is the broadest set of commitments that was sort of out there in an encyclopedia entry. And Neil, you've done good work showing why there are a bunch of other ways to understand this, but here are, I think, the big four. Critical theory is self-reflexive, and what this just means is it appreciates its own historical and social location as a discourse, that it takes seriously the virtues of humility, hospitality, and I would say gratitude for interlocutors to push back on what it might be missing. Now, that seems to me to highlight virtues that Christian ethics also takes very seriously. And it also helps us understand, like Matthew 7 says, that we can very often see the problem in others and miss the problems in ourselves. Critical theory helps us understand those self-reflexive requirements. 2, it's interdisciplinary. And so here, philosophical engagement must always be supplemented by a broader awareness of human knowing and the discourses that attend to that. In particular, critical theorists, of course, were interested in the social sciences, and that seems, again, to be something that Christianity, on a historical vantage point, has been where an enormous amount of the cutting-edge thinking in philosophy, in social sciences, in natural sciences, has been done by people also identified internal to Christian traditions. Certainly not exclusively, but in a time when anti-intellectualism, as Mark Knoll talks about, is something that we must fight against within at least American Christian traditions, it's important that we see a broad interdisciplinary embrace and welcome. That seems like something, again, that Christianity historically has gotten right, and critical theory helps it return to those commitments. Third, critical theory is materialist. And here, the idea is it's got two sides. Theory and practice can never be radically separable. So we are materialists, not, again, as a metaphysics. It's not rejecting the supernatural or rejecting the possibility of the transcendent. It's saying, where is our inquirational focus in this methodological approach? And it is to realize that any theory we hold is also something that is anchored in this lived encounter of bodies in motion in the world, inheriting things as obvious and pitching forth different conceptions of what's possible. And so this material focus is something that allows critical theorists to talk a lot about things like power, and privilege and ideas that then get taken up in particular in veins of critical theory like queer theory and feminism and critical race theory. But again, a focus on the material realities that would let us understand what might be going on in systematic or institutional organizational ways seems to resonate pretty deeply with Ephesians' idea that we are wrestling not just against each other's bodies, but we're also wrestling with powers. And this idea of a power structure or discursive powers seems to me, again, to be something Christianity understands really well. Critical theory helps present that. And then finally, critical theory is emancipatory. And here, the idea is that human flourishing and freedom are fundamental values of this method. Now, that also seems to be something internal to a religious tradition that says, God's freedom is absolute, that there is a commitment for the widow, the orphan, the stranger, that we should do justice, walk humbly, and show mercy, that these are also commitments that Christians not only have traditionally held, but should guide the way that they understand themselves in the world. So when understood as a philosopher, these are methods that then are compatible with a variety of metaphysics. It allows us to understand that what too often gets framed as culture war debates might reflect more of a very particular evangelical conception of how the playing field gets cashed out, rather than understanding these are resources for understanding our own biases, our own pre-commitments, our own assumptions as we go into whatever we find our interlocutors, our social spaces, and ourselves trying to navigate. So there's the 30,000-foot view. I'm going to pass to Kevin to see kind of how he might situate that relative to the church, since he works more in that space. But that's the big shape of an argument.
Awesome. Super, super helpful, Aaron. So it's a methodology, not a metaphysic, right? It exposes, right. You cited Ephesians, that we're waging against powers. You're saying it'll add clarity on what the powers are.
I should say that's not meant to be a exhaustive or exclusive conception. It's just to say, hey, by power, Christians should be interested in talking about powers and then understanding maybe there are supernatural powers in play. Like, that's a conversation to have, but it's not something. The materialism here is not a rejection of Christian theism. It's a focus on the structural ways in which our bodies are not just shaped by bodies. There's more also in play.
So all those methodologies can help Christians who care about, you mentioned emancipation as deeply embedded in Scripture. So not a metaphysic, a methodology to help Christians better understand power, better uplift those oppressed. So super helpful. Kevin, take it away. What do you want to add, brother?
Yeah. So I don't think I'm fine with Aaron's descriptions. I'll just add a little bit to them. I understand postmodernism as a kind of period in that we live in, which is the period that is after modernity, and particularly with regard to epistemology, after the kind of collapse of the Cartesian project, which was a project in strong foundationalism in epistemology, which was basically the effort to get to some structure of justification that all rational people would be required to agree with. So Descartes did that by his skeptical kind of dismantling of all of our knowledge, and then tried to argue his way back up. Then that was moved over in modernity to empiricism and modern science, that would be this thing that we were all supposed to have to agree to in rationality. And that kind of broke down around the 1950s. And so then we have a set of responses to it that are questioning, challenging the idea that there is some one standard that all rational people have to start work from that we all will agree to as we go. And in this sense, it just strikes me as epistemically a kind of anti-idolatry. Aaron is quoting that, you can't look over God's shoulder. I would also go with Thomas Nagel's claim that there is no God's eye perspective for a human being as a central element of like postmodernism. For critical theory, I just agree with what Aaron says, emphasizing that it's a way of dismantling particular ideologies and criticizing institutions that are taken for granted and establish power structures in society in ways that you can't recognize unless you kind of unveil what's going on behind. And this overlaps with the idea also found in postmodernism more broadly, that it's the end of the meta-narrative in justifying social structures. So, and in this, I think it's very similar in some ways to Augustine in De Civitate Dei. When he comes along, there is a tradition of sacralizing the state, both pagan and Christian at the time, that both of them had given narratives that justify the institutions of the state in a particular order. And Augustine comes along and says, look, guess what? The state is just not sacred, right? God is a thing that stands beyond, and the Christian citizenship is not primarily to the state. The Christian citizenship is primarily to the city of God, which stands beyond the state. And so we are pilgrims in the world that need to be able to be critical of our states, critical of those institutions that we live in, and that part of the Christian vision is exactly questioning those meta-narratives that go to justify the finite structures of society in any particular framework so that they can be questioned in light of a transcendent God.
All right. So what I'm hearing in common so far, Kevin and Aaron, is you could think of postmodernity like, or critical theory or whatever combination of the two, however we hash that out. Like if I enter a crime scene and have a black light, that black light is going to expose maybe blood spatter on the wall that's invisible to the naked eye, right? Or a black light has the power to identify counterfeit currency in a way that you couldn't with the naked eye. Or even find bruising on a body that wouldn't be visible to the naked eye. Is that a correct characterization, that as Christians, if we're trying to, like a crime scene investigator, expose where injustice has occurred and bring about greater justice, we can use this tool to move around the room of society, of culture, even of ourselves? I think, Aaron, you made the point that there's a self-critical component to this. We can use the black light of these ideas, these methodologies, to better pinpoint justice, which is therefore going to help Christians trying to make the world a better place. Is that a fair?
Yeah, I think that's right. I would shift the analogy slightly, and I would go more for the Adam Sandler movie Waterboy, where we see the fantastic engagement between the character who's the like Colonel Sanders looking professor and Bobby Boucher, and it says, why are alligators so mean and angry and aggressive? And Boucher responds, "Mama says because they got all those teeth and no toothbrush."
Yeah.
Right? The idea would be what I see critical theory to do. Again, postmodernity I see as a much broader kind of epistemic reminder of, hey, be careful, you're always somewhere. Pay attention to this. Critical theory I see as a much more focused method that is then saying, but hey, if you're going to go operate as a dentist, you need some point along the way not to just take those assumptions by which your identity has been shaped. Mama said it's because no toothbrush, to guide how you then behave in the world once you have moved forward. So it's not so much that it's like this black light that expose what can't be seen. It's
Yeah.
about being aware that we almost always carry with us some set of assumptions that might be right. But as
Yeah.
David Foster Wallace says, the stuff that we take for granted is almost always the stuff that needs most interrogated.
Yeah.
And so critical theory and postmodernity are that sort of a move. It's kind of like, the dad who tells his son when he gets hurt, oh, just rub some dirt on it. Can you imagine that kid growing up to be a surgeon and walking in with a bucket of clay to handle the problems, right? You're like, no, you've got to understand it wasn't that your dad was lying to you, right? It was for a different purpose with a different end. There was a whole structure. There was a relationship that you couldn't understand at 7 or 8. And so part of what critical theory and postmodernity do is help us grow into not the point where, like Kevin said, now we've got it figured out. Now I have arrived at objective capital T truth. But instead, as Meryl Westphal puts it, we take seriously that any capital T truth we affirm and in relation to which we commit our lives, which all of us will do in some way or another, that commitment is still expressed and held as a lowercase t truth because of these epistemic limitations. That doesn't mean that I don't still affirm metaphysical realism. I think there are mind-independent states of affairs. I'm a theist. I'm a personalist theist, right?
Yeah.
But I'm holding all of those views, recognizing there are other reasonable and rational places someone could stand, and I probably would stand elsewhere with a different set of experiences, a different background, a different embodied perspective on the questions that I take myself already to have answers for. So that's the way I'd put it.
Got it. Super helpful. Tim, did you want to add anything before I kick it to?
Nope.
You're good?
Good.
All right. Neil, do you want to take it away? Any thoughts, responses, opening statement-y kind of insights?
Sure. Thanks, Aaron and Kevin, for the description. I think there's a lot of overlap with what I'm going to say next. I'll summarize what I describe as contemporary critical theory. I know Aaron talked about how he sees postmodernism as an overarching framework, just reminding us that we all come from somewhere. There's no God's eye view of reality. And then critical theory is more about then within that framework, interrogating our own assumptions about what we take as true and asking ourselves, is it really true? Is it just one perspective among many? Let me summarize what I talk about when I talk about critical theory. I understand it's a very broad category. It goes all the way back to Horkheimer, maybe back to Karl Marx, depending who you ask. But that, that's 100 years ago. You're dealing with this tradition that's now spawned whole subfields like critical race theory, queer theory, critical pedagogy, post-colonial theory. All of these today fall under this broad umbrella category. So if the category gets too big, it'll encompass all kinds of thinkers, ranging all over the continent over the last century. I want to focus on the ideas that we're seeing in our culture today. And they're not going to be pulled out of thin air. I'll summarize them briefly, but I'm going to give you a few. I can give you. I have actually literally a 5,000-word document I just wrote this morning with quotes supporting these claims are coming from the prominent critical race theorists, queer theorists, post-colonial theorists that are out there. So I'll just summarize this, what I say is contemporary critical theory. And then from there, I want to focus on one major problem I see, which I think we're going to hear is very related to what Kevin and Aaron affirmed, the idea that we need to interrogate what we hold as objective truth, that we can't be sure that our objective truth at capital T is actually capital T. It's all lowercase t truth. And that therefore we have to look somewhere with these, scrutinize these claims, these truth claims, which critical theorists see as instantiating power and privilege and justifying the power of the ruling class. So let's go back. Here are my 4 big ideas for critical theory. Number 1, society is divided into oppressor and oppressed groups along lines of race, class, gender, sexuality, and religion. Kevin talked about these structures of power. Well, yeah, they're cashed out in terms of white supremacy, patriarchy, heterosexism, ableism, etc., by critical theorists writing today. So that's what he means. That's what they mean by structures of power and privilege. And number two, though, oppression, this oppressor-oppressed divide takes place through ideology, or what's called hegemonic power. I think you talked about this with Tim a few weeks ago, is that ideology, Marx and then later Gramsci believed, was this, it's like the Matrix. These sort of ideas have been pulled over your eyes to blind you to the ways in which white people, men, heterosexuals, and Christians have enshrined their values, their lowercase t truths, as the truth in a way that justifies their own privilege. So, number one, this oppressor-oppressed binary, its powers plays out along the lines of race, class, gender, sexuality, religion, a host of other identity markers. And then oppression takes place through ideology. This goes back to Karl Marx's idea that ideology blinds us. It's the reification of the ruling class's values projected onto culture. So the ruling class, through patriarchy, white supremacy, ableism, heterosexism, cisgenderism, Christian hegemony, the ruling class puts their ideas and values and norms into culture in a way that seems natural, commonsensical, God-ordained even. The ruling class mistakes their lowercase t truths for the capital T truth that forces everyone or brainwashes everyone into believing these truths in a way that justifies the power of the ruling class. So then how do we escape that? Number three, through our lived experience. So oppressed people groups, whether it's the poor or women or LGBTQ people or people of color, they can see through these hegemonic narratives, these narratives of power. And then the rest of us are blinded. We're all privileged, so we should defer to the truth, the lived experience of the oppressed people. And then finally, the end goal of critical theory has always been social justice, which they today define as tearing down these systems of power and privilege, which perpetuate the social binary. Okay, I'm going to focus on, I think there are many problems with these ideas. I'll focus on just one today, which is the posture of critical theorists towards truth claims. And they share with postmodernists the skepticism towards the possibility of objective knowledge. They might say, yeah, metaphysically, there are some objective truths out there. There could be, there might not be. Who knows what they are? There might be objective truths like 2 + 2 = 4, or the earth is round. That might actually be true. But our knowledge of those truths should be questioned and interrogated, because we might claim to have this pristine, rationalistic enlightenment view of I have come to the knowledge of the truth. You might claim that, but really we're going to see that these fingerprints of power and privilege all over your truth claims. Really, you're using the truth to justify your own power. That posture, the skepticism towards truth claims, is deadly for Christian theology. I'm going to show you that's my main claim here. Here's one reason why. Let's say a white Christian male says something like this: salvation is through Christ alone. What critical theorists will question then is, well, yeah, right. You're only saying that to justify your white male Christian privilege, right? To gain power over me, to tell me I have to go to your church, believe in your theology, and if I don't, I'll go to hell. So they're skeptical of your truth claim that salvation is through Christ alone. They're skeptical because they see truth claims as a bid for power, like Foucault, like many critical theorists. And if the white male Christian says, oh, wait a minute, I'm not saying that on my own authority. Scripture says there's no other name under heaven by which we must be saved. That's Scripture. That's God's word. The critical theorist will say that's just your Eurocentric, rationalist, white male interpretation of Scripture. So your identity is a proxy for whether or not you have really an access to truth, and we should really turn to the margins, the marginalized people, whether it's women, people of color, LGBTQ people, etc., to get a better insight into what's actually true, because they're not blinded by their privilege. Now, that skepticism towards truth, or selective skepticism towards truth, is going to be deadly. You say, well, why? Let me give you some examples. So the big question here is, if critical theory is ultimately helpful for seeking the truth and for Christian theology, we should see people that are using critical theory and that are major figures in very, very helpful ways. Let me give you an example of people that I think are doing a very bad job and a very dangerous job with critical theory and incorporating it into their theology. Christina Cleveland is a major figure within evangelicalism. She spoke at Cru, InterVarsity, Christianity Today, Lifeway, and major figure. In 2019, she talks about how critical race theory, her words, taught her to see the world as an oppressive ladder with straight white men at the top, trans-black women at the bottom. In 2022, she wrote a book entitled God is a Black Woman. And she now has rejected Christianity completely. She describes herself as worshiping the sacred black feminine, totally detached from Christianity or the Bible in any sense. She says things like this in her book. More than anything, we must eradicate the transphobia within ourselves and our communities. If God is a black woman, then she's a black trans woman, obviously. She says toxic masculinity's idols of knowledge are logic, reason, tradition, certainty, and consensus. She's criticizing logic, reason, tradition as sort of tools of white people and white masculine, white patriarchs. She said she wants, as she continued her path toward the sacred black feminine, quote, I wanted to stop asking, what can I prove? What is orthodox? What can be substantiated by history or scripture? Instead, I wanted to ask, what nurtures hope in my black female embodied soul? What liberates my black female soul? So you turned away from, again, rationalistic approaches to scripture, even to history. She says, what's good for my embodied soul, my lived experience as a black woman? She's changed her focus from what's out there and true to what validates me as an embodied female. I'm going to quote now from Marcella Alphys Reed, who's a queer theologian whom Kevin quotes very positively several times in his own book. This is from her book, Indecent Theology. So she's a queer theologian, University of Edinburgh. She cites Marx 32 times, Gramsci 12 times, Foucault 8 times in her book. Here's a little bit of what she says in her book. Quote, all theology is sexual theology. Theology is a sexual act, and indecent theologians are called to be sexual performers. Quote, the New Testament starts with a quasi-woman, Mary, a debiologized being, and her sexual intercourse with a god. Page 54. Actually, I can't quote that. I'm choosing the tamest quotes, by the way. The other ones are much worse. Here's another quote from her. Quote, who subjugates women as Yahweh does? That's the God of the Old Testament, in the Hebrew Scriptures. Who undertakes sex and war in the name of destiny as does the God of Israel? In the New Testament, the sexual harassment of a child, Mary, and the torture of Jesus are his, that is Yahweh's, main attributes, actions. There's even certainty about Yahweh's preferences. He prefers young girls. And again, that's the tame stuff. And this is a book where she's clearly invoking categories of critical theory, postmodernism, queer theology, queer theory, etc. And finally, last one, I'm going to quote Kevin himself in his book, The Disappearance of Eve and the Gender of Christ, Why Traditional Soteriology Requires a Trans Savior. He writes, Paul and many others will make a hash out of the claim that both males and females are created in the image of God. Page 31. Page 41, misogyny is clearly in play when part of Eve's punishment consists of being ruled by her husband. Now, that punishment was actually spoken by God himself in Genesis 1-3. It wasn't like a narrative commentary. It's like God saying this is your punishment. That's misogyny is clearly in play. Page 191, as with all contexts, sex and gender are not natural in the sense that they exist from time immemorial or immutable. And finally, queer theologians remind us our job cannot simply be expanding the present order to include more people, it must also include the perpetual deconstruction of the present order. That last sentence is important because queer theory, critical theory, postmodernism, they're not just about sort of making small changes in the status quo. They're about deconstructing it, the underpinnings of it, whether it's Derrida undermining Western sort of epistemology and metaphysics, whether it's Marx questioning all of capitalism, or actually all of philosophy in some sense. All of these theories are radical in the sense of undermining the basic, the fundamental. That includes a commitment to undermining basic foundational theology. This is, again, a common theme, especially in queer theory. My only point, I have many more quotes I could share. Here's the question. If we're told that critical theory and postmodernism are these helpful, net helpful tools, what am I reading? And I have, again, dozens, thousands of words of quotes here that I could share with you from people who are scholars, are clearly well-educated, are either they're getting things wrong about critical theory of postmodernism, or they're getting them right, and these tools are poisonous and are not helpful at all for doing good theology and living in God's world. So I'll stop there. I have lots more to say, but I know we have limited time.
Awesome. All right. So thank you, Neil, for those insights. We're going to kick it now to Corey, see if he's got anything to add.
So this is going to be an interesting conversation for sure. My training is more in analytic philosophy. And of course, we all know the battle between the analytics and the continentalists in every department, right? You stay at your end of the hall, we'll stay at our end of the hall. When Neil was mentioning queer theory, I'm thinking about David Halperin's definition, identity without an essence. That's what queer has been defined as by Halperin, and others have jumped on that. And that takes me all the way back to Aristotle. you know, um, I did my dissertation in part on Aristotle. I feel like sometimes we're at that juncture. Aristotle, Plato, and Socrates were carving between two polar perspectives. You had Parmenides on the one hand, who said that there is no change, it's only apparent, and Heraclitus on the other hand, who said the only constant is change itself. You never step into the same river twice. So you're in this Heraclitean flux, identity without an essence. And it's almost like Aristotle's and Plato's projects, in some respects, were to try to carve between that to save knowledge. But in order to have that, you couldn't have the slippery fish that just keeps being elusive and slipping right out of your hand. You've got to be able to have an essence or a form, something that is more stable for knowledge to be possible. And Plato points up, Aristotle down. But as we're talking about this issue and trying to keep us on the ground a bit, um, are critical theory and postmodernism helpful or a hindrance for Christians seeking to make the world a better place? Um, we're going to be talking about truth, theories of truth, but as Neil mentioned, the bulwark of this is on knowledge. Even if there is truth out there, we can't know ultimate reality. That's the noumenal realm, right? So Aristotle said, to summarize, to say of what is that it is true. To say of what is not that it is false. Uh, that's the correspondence theory of truth that the vast majority of Western philosophers throughout history, up until probably Kant, have affirmed. It's the classical view, it's the common sense view, and I would say it's the biblical view. In Deuteronomy 18:32, and in that area, you find God saying, I'm going to raise up a prophet, and if a prophet comes along and he says something and it does not come to pass, then don't follow that guy. There's an assumption of not only the laws of logic, the law of identity, the law of excluded middle, of contradiction there and so forth, but of the correspondence theory of truth. Ibn Sina, the medieval Muslim philosopher, or Avicenna, if people are listening for the Latinists, he said, what he would famously do to show his interlocutors who disbelieved in the laws of logic, anyone who denies the law of non-contradiction should be beaten and burned until they admit that being beaten is not the same as not being beaten, right? So somehow it'll come out. It's undeniable, or at least it's inescapable. Well, these laws of logic are invariant, perhaps abstract entities that are true for all people at all times and all places. And this correspondence theory of truth, these things are a good fit for Christianity. There's a reason why, the medievalists in the Jewish and the Islamic and Christian traditions could easily synthesize Plato and Aristotle a lot easier, I think, than they could Foucault or Derrida or Lyotard or any of those guys. Um, and so I'm not opposed to, reaching out, as Augustine said, and plundering the Egyptians and finding help from Einstein or Bill Gates or whoever can assist, the Christian project, if we're talking about Christians making the world a better place. There are area experts out there. But when I look at, like, say, Aaron talking about how it's a method, I find it helpful, not as a hindrance. I kind of see this as like the next stage after, scientism, methodological naturalism, as a method that is inconsistent with metaphysical theism. In the agora, in the marketplace, we should have more of a methodological neutralism, not a methodological theism or methodological naturalism, and then have the free exchange of ideas there, and to be able to debate, because we have access to reality, or at least we think we do, and we think that we can know it. And it doesn't mean we can know the absolute absolutely. We can know it adequately. If we couldn't, you wouldn't have the kind of technology that we have. So while I do appreciate Merrill Westphal's statement, you can't see over God's shoulder, even Aquinas believed that, even before the fall, before corruption. He believed that faith was necessary until the beatific vision, in part because faith biblically is a venture to trust. He wants, forward movement. But we find these things that we don't construct, that we don't invent, that we discover in reality that are things that I probably can have certainty in. I'm all for the postmodern stance to call into question some of strong foundationalism and the arrogance some people have in their dogmatism. But there's some things you just cannot get around, and there are certain things you can't not know. Paul addresses this in Romans 1 and 2. And so we have like the laws of logic referred to. We find John 1:1, right? We have the Christian narrative, meta-narrative of creation, corruption, redemption, and restoration in Genesis 1, Genesis 3, then again in John 1 and John 3. But in John 1, he says, in the beginning, and the Jewish audience listening is saying, I've heard that passage before. And then instead of just using one word, rhema, he's trying to reach a Greek audience too. And so he uses the word logos. NRK en ha logos. In the beginning was the word, or the logic, and the logic was with God and was God and became flesh and dwelt among us. And hey, that person's Jesus. And you shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free. And we have in the Christian worldview a good, comfortable fit with things like the correspondence theory of truth, the common sense view, the classical view, with the laws of logic. We begin with a worldview of mind and not matter. It's not a surprise then that out of the Christian worldview, we were the ones largely who started the universities. Yeah, there was Plato's Academy and Aristotle's, Lyceum and the madrasas and things like that. I'm talking about the universities. These were Christians who believed that there was mind, or like what Kevin Carnahan was saying, Thomas Nagel, a no God's eye point of view. Well, Johannes Kepler, who is a Christian, his faith informed and inspired his scientific endeavors, thinking God's thoughts after him. All we're talking about is language that's analogous. It doesn't have to be univocal. It certainly isn't going to be equivocal. We don't need to have absolute knowledge of the absolute. We need to have adequate knowledge. And I think we can have that. And because our beliefs precede behavior, always, beliefs precede behavior. And because belief is it's a degreed property, right? If you believe something at 51%, you're not likely going to act upon it. But if you believe something at 70%, yes, 90%, boom, you're all over that. You're getting closer to certainty. 99%, you might give your life for this, right? When we look at the whole issue of knowledge historically, starting from Plato, and we know this if we've had any philosophy reading or classes, justified true belief, or whatever we make of some of those concepts, but we want to have beliefs that are true, and we have good reasons to hold these things. Christianity is a knowledge tradition. It's not even a faith tradition. Faith, pistis, emuna in Hebrew, or fides, like confidence in Latin. Belief, trust, faith. This is part of the tripartite view of knowledge, but we want to have confidence. The greater degree of confidence that we can have, the likelihood we're going to act on it and make the world a better place. So here's one of my fundamental problems. If we're claiming the name of Christ here, let's say, right, from conservative to progressive Christianity or anything in between, and we're saying that Christ is the centerpiece, well, Jesus is the logic of God, the logos about the theos, theology. Can we have theological knowledge? Well, you would think that an omnipotent being would have the ability, if he could create the universe, to create a safe pathway where people could have at least adequate knowledge of him. And Jesus himself said the purpose of life in John 17 is to know God. Knowledge is not peripheral to the Christian experience, it's central. And again, it doesn't have to be absolute. It doesn't have to be dogmatism. It has to be at least adequate. And what I see is this football game lining up here, and you've got linemen on two sides, and you've got the Christian meta narrative, the Christian worldview, creation, corruption, redemption, and restoration. And then you've got this, as Aaron said, a methodology, or some others might say it is a worldview, or at least it's a view about the world, and it's got a view about reality and knowledge and the good, all three branches of philosophy. They line up on the opposite side. It's like methodological naturalism for a theist. That's not a good tool to use. It's not a good method to use. At least let's go neutral, methodological neutralism. Because looking at, again, like Aaron did, I looked at the Stanford, encyclopedia, because sometimes you could say this about Christians too, but if you get 5 different postmodernists, you might have 600 different opinions, right? Because how it starts out is that postmodernism is indefinable, is a truism. This is what Aristotle was pulling his hair out and becoming bald like me, because this is Heraclitean flush. You never step into the same river twice. Not only is it not the same river, but it's not even the same person. It's all in flux. And this is the problem, is it's indefinable. We want something we can sink our teeth into. Or when I look at Christopher Butler's Postmodern, Oxford University Press, very short introduction, a great deal of postmodernist theory depends on the maintenance of a skeptical attitude. And he goes on to talk about the one who coined, as we all know, the expression postmodernism. And that was a 1979 Leotard. And
Hey, Corey, can I jump in real quick?
Yes, please.
Yeah, just trying to make sure everybody's time here.
Okay.
Great insights.
Perfect.
I want to.
This is good.
Yeah, this is good. This is what happens when you get a lot of academics in
My
the same.
conclusion, Thad, is just
Yeah.
that I think these two things are instantly at odds. They don't
Yes.
fit well. One is a
Yeah, so-
knowledge tradition, and one is knowledge subversive.
Let's test that. I want to propose sort of a in real time thought experiment, because I'm sure we've alienated 90% of our audience by being the academic nerds that we are. So let me try to bring the categories that have been put on the table down through the atmosphere back to the real world where we live and breathe. So when there was a reaction video to Corey and I's conversation by Tim, by Kevin, by Aaron, one of the points that came up was in terms of let's just say, for the sake of the conversation, that postmodernism and critical theory are, let's say, they don't entail a metaphysic. So I can be like Aaron, I could be a theistic personalist. I can be an open theist. I can make positive metaphysical claims about God, but then draw from postmodernity or critical theory to better understand the world, better spot injustice, and so forth. Better interrogate my own truth claims and the meta narratives of others. Let's say we're sticking with the methodology here. Well, part of the methodology is, and Neil brought this out in his 4 points about critical theory, is the main emphasis epistemically as a methodology on my lived experience, right? Lived experience takes on a lot of weight. And so this was, I'm going to quote you, Tim, correct me if I'm misquoting you. But you, in that episode, that reaction video, you said, and a lot of this I would agree with, you said, I can never live as a black man or black woman in America because I'm not that person, right? So there are different experiences that they're going to have. There are different truths that they're going to face in their own embodied reality that I'm never going to experience. So what's wrong with sitting down and shutting up and listening and then taking their story seriously and letting it shape how I then move through the world? I mean, I would argue this is almost, dare I say, Tim's words here, dare I say, Christ-like, or even further triggering, biblical in some way, right? And when Tim said that, Aaron and Kevin were heartily nodding along. Now, if I'm hearing you in a generous light, Tim, you're saying essentially when Paul says, be slow to speak, quick to listen, kind of thing, um, to weep with those who weep, to grieve with those who grieve, to rejoice with those who rejoice. That we're all on the same page. That empathy is there's a biblical way to do empathy that requires, hey, maybe my experience is different from yours. So, having said all that, let me just share, because this conversation can get real abstract real quick and lose a lot of people. I'm a white dude. I'm a white, straight Christian male. And so, so I want to share the lived experiences of a few folks who don't share my melanin deficiency, folks who aren't as pale skinned as I am, to help the conversation come down from abstraction through the atmosphere down to the real world, where we live and breathe. And so these aren't my words. I'm just going to quote from a handful of friends of mine on this. This is my friend Monique Duson. I have less melanin than her. She says, I discovered the deep conflict between a Christian worldview and critical race theory. With critical race theory's constant focus on evil systems, I had become oblivious to the evil in my own heart, and I couldn't see aspects of my own privilege. I had become blind to my own prejudices, and CRT encouraged my tribal favoritism that kept me from taking white voices seriously in conversations about justice. I wasn't just a victim of America's racist systems, I also perpetuated the racism I claimed to hate. According to historic Christianity, Monique Duson says, salvation is the good news of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. But CRT pulled me away from that good news into a social justice gospel in which the finished work of Jesus wasn't enough. Activism to end quote-unquote oppression, as defined by critical race theory, became a gospel essential. But Scripture consistently defines us as brothers and sisters. Critical theories split us into intersectional tribes. Critical theories split us into intersectional tribes. According to CRT, humanity's fundamental problems are whiteness and oppression. The beliefs of CRT weren't part of the gospel. They form a different gospel altogether. So there you have one dear sister giving her lived experience on these questions. Let me cite another person with more melanin than I have. This is a dear brother. He mentored me for the last 5 years. He recently went on to be with Jesus, and that is the legend of the civil rights movement, John Perkins. Perkins says, the gospel of Jesus' incarnation, his perfect life, his death as our substitute, his triumph over sin and death is good news for everyone. It's multicultural good news. In the blood of Jesus, we're able to truly see ourselves as one race, one blood. Now listen to this. This next sentence from John Perkins ought to stop us cold in our tracks. He says, we've got to stop playing the race game. We've got to stop playing the race game. Christ alone can break down the barriers of prejudice and hate we all struggle with. There's no power greater than the love expressed in Jesus. That's where we get real human dignity. If we replace the gospel with this or that man-made ideology or political agenda, we ain't doing biblical justice. Now, in the context of Perkins' statement there, it was a preface to my book where I'm dealing with critical theories. And he, in his words, is saying this is a race game that actually pulls us away from the gospel of Christ, that takes us away from doing biblical justice. I'll just give one more quick example and then kick it to the rest of you. This is from a dear friend out in New York, a pastor who also does not share my melanin deficiency. His name's Edwin Ramirez. He says, when I was woke, I didn't realize how much resentment I harbored. Only after rejecting the ideas of the woke movement, its doctrine, and the doctrines it preaches, was I able to see my own sinful biases. By that time, I had unwittingly hurt many people and severed friendships. I imbibed such racist ideas from theologians like James Cone. In applying Cone's teachings, I struggled to see fellow members as equally forgiven, loved, and embraced by God. Why? and this is where critical theory, my critique of critical theory, it makes us so race-focused that it demolishes Christian unity. Edwin Ramirez goes on to say that everything was about racism all the time. After weekly sermons, people would gather, and I prepared for verbal combat against anyone who didn't see all the oppression I saw. So critical theory, we're talking about it as a method to spot oppression. And here's somebody who had that epistemology or that methodology become activated in his mindset. And this is how he's explaining his lived experience of thinking that way. I was prepared for verbal combat against anyone who did not see all the oppression I saw. I could not enjoy the saints for who they were as individuals. Everything was about racism all the time. If a white person didn't see things my way, I convinced myself that their racial bias left them hopelessly blind to social injustice. Then the Lord opened my eyes and set me free from an unexpected place. I was in a predominantly white church in rural America, visiting with my family. We started singing one of my favorite songs, Behold Our God. And scanning the room, my eyes fell on an old lady who was worshiping God. And it hit me. That older white lady, that's my sister in the Lord. Bible passages about the redemptive work of Christ came rushing to my mind. Then came the voice of God in verses commanding Christians to love one another. I left the church humbled by the reality of my own weakness and utter dependence on Christ. I had been so blinded by an ideology that divided people by skin color, and the ideology Edwin's talking about here is critical race theory, that I missed the blessing of seeing the sufficiency of Christ's atonement. Though I considered myself woke, my bitterness toward white people had closed my eyes to the marvelous saving power of the gospel. So if you're not heavily involved in this, Edwin says, don't feel like you're missing out. You aren't. Rather than trying to wrap your brain around all the slanted sociological terms and ideologically edited historical narratives, I encourage you to look to Christ in Scripture. So there I just laid out a case that if we're using critical theory and postmodernity as a methodology, not necessarily a metaphysic, then part of that methodology is exposing systems of power masquerading as truth claims and taking the lived experiences of people in oppressed categories seriously. And so I just shared the story of some folks who don't share my lack of melanin, and they have found critical theories and postmodernity to be deeply harmful to their spiritual lives, to their communities, to their families, to their attempt as Christians to make the world a better place. So I guess the question is, do we take their lived experiences seriously, or any of the other angles that have come up in the last hour? So now we're going to enter a time of let's everybody try to keep our comments short rather than grandstanding or mic hogging. Let's have a lively and friendly back and forth. So whoever wants to go, it's all you.
So, Thaddeus, I think what you just said was very helpful. Corey, Neil, thank you so much for your accounts. Very articulate and would require far more time than we have to think through all of the responses. I am going to bypass all of the notes I was taking and the point-by-point responses. And Corey, your confusing correspondence with deflationism and Tarski's account and paraconsistent logic's response to the law of non-contradiction. We're going to set all that aside, which I hate to do because, ooh, that's fun. And instead, just say, Thaddeus, I think by taking seriously those experiences that you just described, it doesn't lead to the conclusion that then it seems like you're drawing. Taking those experiences seriously is, thank goodness, I applaud, amen to them finding some way out of resentment and cynicism and hatred towards joy and fulfillment. I'm all in. Now, I don't think critical theory is the problem. It seems to me that when we talk about things like critical race theory, it doesn't create divisions. Racism does. Critical theory identifies those divisions as they've played out in power structures. Queer theory doesn't set up binaries. sexism does. And queer theory is trying to deconstruct some of those assumptions by which we then narrate ourselves and our world. And so
But
that
what
then,
I'm sorry to interrupt, but wouldn't they just say, now here's a white guy rewriting my story? Because they are saying the opposite of what you just said. They're saying it was actually critical theory,
Mhm.
critical race theory, that locked them into this mindset where everything was about race all the time. And it became a source of division, misery, and oppression in their own lives. And here's some white guy telling me, no, 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 your lived experience was actually this, because critical theory exposes those binaries. What you experience, like, wouldn't they just come back and deconstruct the deconstructionist and say, how dare you tell me
they
what my
might.
lived experience meant?
They might, and I would then respond, hey, we need to think more about that because maybe you're right. Maybe I'm misunderstanding something, right? The idea, though, is I'll give you another example of lived experience. I was in an Arkansas church, was entirely African-American, except for my wife and I. We attended there for several years. Absolutely amazing church. I was honored to be part of it. After we had been there a few weeks, though, I went to the pastor, who was about 2-3 years younger than me. And I said, hey, I just want to meet with you. I appreciate your welcome, your hospitality. I'm a little bit concerned, though, because I recognize the history of the Black church. I have read James Cone, who I see as a great resource for everyone thinking about these things. And I don't want race to be this like issue because now you've got this white family showing up at your church. And his response to me, which was fantastic, he looked across the desk at younger guy than me, and he said, boy, the fact that you think that we could set race aside just proves you're white. So the reality is the assumptions we make are always anchored in stuff that makes it really hard to understand our assumptions as anything but obvious. And so the broader point to knowledge, which is the only thing I'll say kind of philosophically, is when we think about this objective account of knowledge or Christianity as a knowledge tradition, I would cite the Catholic philosopher who helps us understand these things really well, Alistair MacIntyre, when he says, but look, whose account of Christianity, which interpretive structure? And so, yes, for 5 white guys, and Neil, I know you're half Indian, but for a bunch of effectively white dudes talking about Christianity, we're already talking about it in such a narrow American evangelical white church context that appeals to this is just what Christianity is, creation, fall, redemption, etc., is already to be operating in a theological tradition.
Yes.
So claims that we can go to the Bible and it's just there and objective, and well, I would just say, look, what is the New Testament? Couldn't God have given us, here's the truth? Yeah, what did God do? Offered us 4 different personal accounts of relations to a personal example of the historical Christ.
Yeah, let me just
Why?
interject real quickly, Aaron. I hear you, and let me just take the trajectory of your comment to its logical conclusion, citing, I think all 3 of you, correct me if I'm wrong, Kevin, Tim, Aaron, are fans of James Cone. And in this just brief quote, I want to complete the thought that you were just stating, and tell me if you think Cone's wrong about this. He says, this is from Black Liberation Theology. He says, if there's one brutal fact that centuries of white oppression have taught blacks, it's that whites are incapable of making any valid judgments about human existence. Let me read that again. Whites are incapable of making any valid judgments about human existence. And so if Cone is correct here, why should anybody listening take anything as 3 white men on the other side of this question are saying as having any valid insight into human existence? Or do you think James Cone is wrong about that?
I would say I find proof texting to be a horrible... I was going to say proof texting is a horrible way of reading the Bible. It's also a horrible way of reading any scholar
You
or
can
any
read the
book.
context. It's even worse.
I have read it. I've taught him for years, man. I'm happy to. But what's he claiming? If white people ignore the ideological frames by which they can't make sense of the oppression internal to which their identity is nested, then their claims about human experience are already so narrow, so naive, and so problematic that they can't make claims about human nature. That sounds not only true, but that sounds like something every white person should say, oh God, help me not to lose myself in that very narrowing of the truth, the mystery, the unfolding grace that God has provided to us in a world that far outstrips those systems.
Yeah, I would also say if you're going to read Cone, you've got to read Cone in the full context of his treatment of whiteness and blackness, where he's fairly clear that whiteness and blackness is not, as he's using it, simply a matter of melanin. He's using these as moral categories, and in part, what he's doing is he's trying to trigger something in the reader that identifies the ways that these colors have been used, say, to talk about darkness and blackness as evil throughout history, and he's reversing that rhetoric, but he's explicit at times in saying, I'm not saying all white people are evil. I am using whiteness as a category for a particular moral status. And so you can't just pull something out of Cone about white and black and treat it as if he's just using these as straightforward claims about race.
Which is
I agree.
especially true in his treatment of Niebuhr, upon whom he draws so deeply and credits for helping him think theologically, but then also of whom he is critical when Niebuhr, a white man, falls prey to these assumptions of whiteness as a moral category.
Let me just, and I'll shut up. I'll make this my last comment for a while because I don't want to be the Mike Hogger. So Kevin, I hear you loud and clear, and Aaron, you can't just proof text, right? You can't just yank a Cone statement that sounds very shocking without reading the context. And Kevin, you're and both of you have taught Cone's ideas. You're familiar with his work. And so I want to be very clear. This isn't proof texting in the way that somebody might yank Jeremiah 29. I know the plans I have for you. I understand that Cone defines whiteness not in a way that maps on directly to skin tone in some contexts. But what is the context of what I just read? You tell me how I'm reading this wrong. This is the context. While whites undergo the true experience of conversion wherein they die to whiteness, so there's whiteness as an ideology, not a skin color, and are reborn anew in the struggle against white oppression for the liberation of the oppressed, there's a place for them in the black struggle for freedom. Here, reconciliation becomes God's gift of blackness through the oppressed of the land. But it may, so right there, blackness here isn't referring to large melanin count in skin cells, right? So we're being faithful to Cone's authorial intent here. But watch where he goes from here. He says it must be made absolutely clear that it is the black community that decides both the authenticity of white conversion and also the part those converts will play in the black struggle for freedom. The converts can have nothing to say about the validity of their conversion experience or what is best for the community of their place in it, except as permitted by the oppressed community itself. And I'll shut up here soon. Again, just finishing up the Cone quote. White converts, if there are any to be found, must be made to realize that they're babies who have barely learned to walk and talk. They must be told when to speak and what to say, otherwise they will be excluded from our struggle. Unless whites, now pay attention how whites and blacks are used in this sentence, this is melanin. Unless whites can get every single black person to agree that reconciliation is realized, there's no place whatsoever for white rhetoric about the reconciling love of blacks and whites. Just because we work with them and sometimes worship alongside them should be no reason to claim that they're truly Christians and thus part of our struggle. And so this is the Cone that Edwin Ramirez, a brother with more color than I have, is saying it was these ideas that are very akin to critical theory that put him into a state of mind that made him less Christian, less of a loving father, less able to worship with people with different melanin than him. So why is my interpretation of Cone here, where he's saying white-skinned people and black-skinned people, he's having us as a methodology now? Well, I'll shut up. I'm
But
going
I
on
just
too
want to go
long.
back. So I want to ask a sort of more basic question, which go back to my original query and criticism of critical theory and postmodernism, which is that you keep saying, there's got to be a ground somewhere to fall back on. You're like, well, this is hard to understand. This is, we have to interrogate ourselves and question this and question that. Everything is sort of up in the air, but you got to fall back on certainty in some point. So, for example, here you're saying, well, Cone doesn't really mean black and white as in ethnic groups or melanin. He's not saying that. But you're very confident in your interpretation of Cone, right? Because I read what Thaddeus is reading. I get all these quotes in front of me in my screen right here. There's only one principle which guides the thinking and action of black theology: an unqualified commitment to the black community. That's the black community. It's not whites and blacks. It's the black community. Here's another one: whites are in no position to question the legitimacy of black theology. Whites cannot possibly know what sin is from a black perspective. This is about people with skin colors, not just some nebulous abstract theory. Now, you might say, no, he really is talking about whiteness as an ideology, like lots of critical race theorists do. But how can you know that with certainty if your whole premise is, everything's negotiable with talk and dialogue and converse, and you can't be dogmatic about this, but you always come down on the side of certainty when it comes to like progressive theology. Like, I know what he's definitely not saying this. He's definitely saying this. How can you know that?
I haven't claimed certainty about anything.
Okay. So he might be truly saying that white people with white skin color can't be Christian.
As a matter of fact, I accept in this case that Thaddeus is right, that he's talking about white and black as skin tones. I accept that this was that's what he was doing.
Great.
I also think that what he's doing is saying you can't have a white savior complex. You can't decide that you, in fact, know what is best for another community without paying attention to the views of that other community. And as a member of the black community, we're not going to allow white people to come in and tell us what our own experiences have been. And I take that to be his main point, and I think that's entirely correct.
But he's also saying white people can't have any valid insight into the human condition.
Yeah, why isn't that his main point?
That.
Like you say, well, he's making several points. Okay, but the main thing he seemed to say in that section, which Thaddeus read, is that you have no place in my church, and I'll decide whether or not you're a Christian or not. I mean, he says that several times.
And they have no valid insights into human.
Yeah, right. So my only point is this.
I don't know, but I didn't hear that, Thaddeus, in what you read from Cone. What I heard was he's writing in the context, I think, the 1970s. I just want to say one thing quickly, and I'll shut up. But two things I want to point out that are kind of relevant. Number one, the only reason why we're talking about a critical race theory is because Christopher Rufo decided to make it a talking war point, and the white evangelical church got on board to push all this content about how critical race theory is doing all these different things, making people racist, etc. And Thaddeus, with all due respect, I think it's a little bit disingenuous to quote three people that we have no context about. Have they read Derek Bell? Have they read Kimberly Crenshaw? Or did they read, or not you, Neil, I'm talking about that. The people that Thaddeus quoted, the three people that you quoted that we can't ask, did they read Kimberly Crenshaw or did they read Vody Bachman's Fault Lines? Because depending on where you read, these versions of these things will shape all of this.
Let me answer.
And
I think it's also studied sociology, where she learned critical theory and was an advocate of critical race theory for over 10 years. She wasn't reading Rufo. She wasn't reading John McWhorter or Coleman Hughes. She was reading Kimberly Crenshaw, like all the Derek Bell. That's where she got her education. Same could go for Edwin Ramirez. He said in his lived experience, he read James Cone.
But those three statements doesn't automatically make the critical race theory inherently what those people said, right? They had those experiences. No, I'm not discounting. I didn't say that they can't believe it. I just said, I hear you. I understand
they're wrong about critical theory.
I would say I disagree on maybe some of the
So, as
tenets,
a
which is
white
what
man, you think these black people understand critical theory poorly, and you have a better
never
take
said
on
that.
it?
No, you're reading those things into what I'm trying to say, but that's besides the point. Cone, the only point I'm trying to make is that Cone is writing in a very important historical context of American history, which is based on racism. This country was based on race-based chattel slavery. My parents were around when segregation was still a thing. So I think what James Cone is saying in that context makes complete sense. As a white man who has listened to the black experience, I have learned that if I come in swinging, saying, you know what, let me help you, let me do this, but I haven't paid attention, I'm doing exactly the thing that Cone is claiming white people do, where they come in, they claim to have all these kinds of truths, and yada yada yada. And I just think that that's important to call out in this conversation. Like
Isn't that what you're doing right now, though?
the context that Cone's writing
critique.
in, the context that Cone's writing in, to me, makes complete sense. That's my only point on this. Like, I don't know why it's so controversial.
Yeah,
what he said.
I would also want to say that you're citing Cone from very early on. I mean, there's a whole development of these things that comes with the development of intersectionalism that Cone had to respond to people who were critical of him for oversimplifying the black community when he wasn't actually paying attention to certain members of the black community, and that Cone actually came around in time to admit that some of his early statements were oversimplified and that he wasn't paying enough attention, which is exactly what a person who is engaged in this should be doing, is reassessing their earlier statements and coming to question them.
Yep. I would just say quickly, the whole reason I brought this up was, again, a thought experiment to test whether critical theory as a methodology, not a metaphysic, works. And so I cited voices of color who, according to the methodology, their lived experiences are authoritative and shouldn't be questioned. And all I've heard in response is white people giving a reinterpretation of their words, that if now we're going to apply a deconstructionist or the methodology of critical theory or postmodernism, all you guys are arguing is a veiled attempt to consolidate and to hide your own white supremacy.
Right. So I think that
All
what I'm trying to point out is that, so forget Cone, take Kimberly Crenshaw, former evangelical Christian who now worships. She literally went around France worshiping black Madonna statues, like fondling them, caressing them. You know, that's what she worships now. She says that. She says at one point she's a witch. Maybe tongue in cheek. My point is, let's say that she says something like, as a black woman, I just know that the white male God of the Bible is wicked and Jesus is just an oppressive character, right? Now, you might, so all she's saying is, well, no, she's saying something objective, like Jesus is not God. He did not rise from the dead. I do not worship him. We should all, if you're a black woman, you should reject him, if any self-respect. She said that. You can listen, be humble, understand she's been hurt in the past. But is that true or false? And if it's false, then you have an objective standard that you're saying, look, I sympathize, I'm caring, I'm kind, I want to hear you, listen to you, weep with you. But at some point, she's speaking falsehood. But that, if you're saying that's false, you're taking a view from somewhere. You're taking a view from, there's an objective statement you're making, right? Like you have to have some objective ground to stand on to say, no, Jesus did rise from the dead. Or not.
No one's denying that we can make truth claims
that correspond to reality.
Neil, look, man, Logic 101 is the move you're making, and that's fine. It's a good one. Self-referential incoherence is a fallacy.
Okay.
The point is, the whole move we made in saying postmodernity is a reminder that making truth claims can be made with different levels of confidence, Corey. Of course they can, relative to the evidence we've provided and the arguments that we have offered for that evidence, and in response to the open objections that have been leveled by the discursive community in which we are located. All is yes. To say any truth claim requires a view from nowhere, or any truth claim is a statement about objective fact, misunderstands the epistemology by which Kimberly Crenshaw is operating, by which Judith Butler understands gender, by which we would then talk about something like Jesus. Do I believe that Jesus is the Son of God, revealed internal to the Christian tradition? Yes. what does it mean to say that? Well, a really good question would be, well, which Jesus? Is it the Jesus of dispensationalism? I hope not, because I think that's idolatrous. Is it the Jesus of white nationalists? No, I think that's evil. Is it the Jesus under this sign we conquer? I hope not. I think that's imperialism. Is it the Jesus of a canonic message offered to embodied humans where the Good Samaritan story, which focuses on race, models for us what it looks like to be receptive to the needy, the poor, the oppressed, and the marginalized in the world, rupturing the very categories of power by which the Levite passes the member of his own tribe? Yeah, I'm in with that Jesus. And
But
so when, go ahead.
well, it all goes back to, so you're saying, I don't hope it's not this Jesus, I hope it's not that Jesus, I hope it's not this Jesus, I hope it's this Jesus. Okay, and we all have our hopes and dreams about our own Jesus. My question is, if you take this step back and take this approach to power and knowledge, right? How do I not escape the situation in which I deconstruct your just claim? You just claimed I like this Jesus, not that Jesus. And I turn around and say, of course you want this Jesus, the Jesus of the Good Samaritan, because you are a progressive 21st century American liberal who likes that story, and you're trying to keep down me, and I'm a white nationalist, and I like this Jesus. And of course, your narrative of truth privileges your Jesus. So I can turn the tables and deconstruct your Jesus. But we're left again with, I'm not saying relativists, because we're not denying there's a Jesus out there who's real, but we're left with epistemic relativism, meaning no one can adjudicate between whose narrative. It's like,
do you think?
Go ahead.
It's like the Spider-Man meme. You're all at
do
fault.
you think? Do you think there is some utterly secure foundation on which you are clearly more rational than everyone else?
That's right, because I'm going to say, Neil, of course we're left with that epistemic relativism. That's the glass darkly. That's the whole point of saying, let's then search the scriptures, the tradition, our reason, our experience, listen to the critics in order to take seriously why we would stand where we stand and be willing to risk our lives in light of it. So as far as I'm concerned, like, I'm far less interested in quoting Kimberly Crenshaw in public spaces than I am in trying to hear people saying, I can't afford healthcare. So sure, my politics are involved in my theology, but why am I committed to that being a good? Because the model of Jesus that I find in a multiplied account of personal relationships to a God who in incarnate messaging says our bodies matter. Otherwise, the incarnation doesn't. And our bodies, the whole idea of the woman at the well is a story about sexism as well as a story about what we would call sin. The idea is you can't understand one without the other. And all Kevin and I are trying to suggest is, hey, we don't get outside of the discourse. We do the best we can to live internal to it. And as far as I'm concerned, whatever that discourse is that then accords to the fruit of the Spirit, is it inviting other people to the table? Is it asking them to be able to flourish? Is it providing for them the ability to find dignity in a social structure? If the answer is no, I would say it lacks the very fruit of the Spirit that we are called to embody.
But well, I'll say one last thing. How can you prioritize the fruit of the Spirit over any other category or any other letter or any other passage of the entire Bible? You're prioritizing one thing and saying this shouldn't be deconstructed. Why? Why can't I deconstruct that thing? I look at you and say, well, you're a progressive. Of course you like the fruit of the Spirit. I like the part about the conquest and of Canaan and hell. I'm going to prioritize that.
Of course it can be deconstructed. The idea that it can be deconstructed is, the best answer for that is Derrida, who says the only thing that's undeconstructible is the name we use called justice. Justice, if there is such a thing, is undeconstructible. But what does that mean? If there is such a thing, is we've got to do the hard work of recognizing what we name justice is almost always going to reflect a particular set of interests that themselves should be challenged.
That's a perfect point. Let me do exactly what you just said, Aaron. I love that. That the only thing that can't be deconstructed is our concept of justice. And you're saying, so
No, not our concept.
let
That
me
is
apply.
the
Let me just quickly
justice.
apply your methodology
But
to
no,
what you
stop.
said.
You're misunderstanding the
Okay,
claim, which
let
is
me hear.
again the whole point, man.
Okay.
Justice, if there is such a thing. This name,
Yes.
it's Meister Eckhart, it's Pseudo Dionysus, it's the apophatic tradition that recognizes whatever we claim is under the name of God.
Okay.
That can't be deconstructed. Our concepts, oh my goodness. Thank you, Meister Eckhart, for saying, I pray God forgive me of my concepts of God. That's all deconstructible. That's what I
I
make
got you.
that's important, right?
I got you. I hear you. So let me sort of turn the epistemology up on itself with what you just said, because when you were talking to Aaron, I'm just sitting here amening so much of it, thinking like, yeah, Jesus, the parable of the Good Samaritan, Jesus really goes out of his way to mess with the ethnic hierarchies of the first century. The fact that the hero of the story is the Samaritan, and the villains of the story are the priest and the Levite. Man, Jesus is just shaking all that stuff up. He's messing it up in the best way possible. I'm with you. When Jesus is elevating the poor, when so much of the New Testament is undermining the forms of partiality and ethnic partiality that were part of the first century early church. I think, Kevin, it was you in your response to Corey and I's video where you were talking about Romans 1. And you were talking about, okay, here's the explanation of the Gentile world. And you rightly connected that to Paul's laying a sort of trap where the Jews are like, okay, well, we're more righteous. We're better because we're in this club. And so here's this explanation, a very unflattering explanation of the non-Jew. And then the trap is sprung in chapter 2 and chapter 3, where it's like, you can't look to your Jewishness to think you're somehow justified, right? Am I understanding you guys accurately here? So let's now, since we found some common ground, let's interrogate some of the stuff that Aaron in particular, you were saying, this is why this is going to lead to X, Y, or Z politic. So when it comes to critical theories, in particular, it seems like critical race theory has come to the fore of the conversation, even though there's a zillion angles we could take this. But let me quote, this is a sociologist, Musa al-Gharbi, who's not like some right-wing conservative Christian nationalist or anything. Musa al-Gharbi says there's abundant research demonstrating harm caused by heightened perceptions of racism, discrimination, racialized violence, and racial inequality. There are very well established and highly adverse impacts of the psychological and even physical well-being of people of color when they are taught to perceive more racism, more racial inequality, and discrimination. We have ample reason to believe that sensitizing people to better perceive and take greater offense at these slights actually would cause harm. And so to clarify here, we're white dudes. This is a black sociologist, Musa al-Gharbi. He's done a lot of work on this, showing that the ideas of critical race theory, and I've seen it, I've had a front row seat to this with some of my friends, that once they imbibe the ideas of critical race theory that you think is a methodology that's helpful for identifying injustice, I have heard their stories that once they take on critical race theory categories, it's harmful to them because now they read racism into virtually every encounter. And al-Gharbi is saying the very thing that you think would help people of color, like critical race theory, does precisely the opposite. And here's a black sociologist leaving his receipts. And so what I'm doing here is interrogating your endorsement of critical theory to whatever degree you endorse it, and saying that in and of itself, you're the three white guys on the other side of this question, your support for critical race theory, I'm deconstructing it and saying it's really a way to inflict further harm on communities of color. And I'm offering evidence. I've offered several voices of color who are saying the very ideas the three of you are defending have been profoundly hurtful to them. I want to hear some kind of evidence that critical race theory or any version of critical theory has actually uplifted anybody who's oppressed.
Are you familiar with redlining in the 1970s?
Absolutely. I've written about it.
Okay, good.
It
So
was
do
horrible.
you believe? Yeah, absolutely horrible. And do you believe that that continues to have effects today
Absolutely.
that
Yes.
that disproportionately affect Black people?
Yes, there's a
Yes.
brilliant ministry out there listeners should check out called Green Line. Green Line is run by some Black brothers and sisters in the church who help Black families raise money to help undo the ongoing impact of redlining. Everybody should check it out. I'll leave links in the show notes so people can support that ministry.
So do you believe that pointing out that redlining has occurred and that Black people have suffered on because of that is a negative thing for Black
Not at
people?
all.
No, I've written about it.
No, tell the truth.
Okay, that's
Tell the
critical
truth
theory.
No, it's
of
not.
racial history and its ongoing impacts
Yeah,
is great.
Tell
the whole truth.
That is
Tell the truth
absolutely
of how
an analysis of the institutions and structures of society and how that has institutionalized racial bias in a way that continues to influence today the possibilities of Black people and white people. And critical race theory is exactly trying to go and highlight the fact that these structures and institutions exist and then try and figure out how to undo them or address them. So if you're participating in that, you're participating in critical race theory.
No. So critical race theory, you can do all of that from a classical liberal perspective, which they would utterly reject. There was a huge dispute between critical race theorists and liberals in the 1880s and 90s over these kind of issues, where the liberals were saying you do not need critical race theory, this neo-Marxist framework, to do any of this stuff. And they were a battle. It was not between conservatives and critical race theorists, between CRTs and liberals over this very issue. They're like, you don't need this stuff. So no, CRT is way beyond what you're describing. And I get, so I'm
Yeah.
totally okay with people talking about all that stuff you described, but it's not CRT. I can show you the receipts.
Not only do you not need that stuff, I would take it a step further. Again, citing only scholars with more melanin than me. If you read Glenn Lowry, if you read Tom Sowell, if you read Coleman Hughes, if you read Shelby Steele, if you read Walter Williams, if you read Jason Riley, the list could go on. These are all Black scholars. And one of the arguments they've made, I'm with you, Kevin, and I would assume with Tim and Aaron, that racism isn't just a personal thing. It can be baked into systems. I think we could find common ground there that systemic racism is real, that it's a problem, that as Christians, we should care deeply about systemic racism. And so, Kevin, when you bring up redlining, I talk about it in my book extensively. Like, this is evil. Think of the GI Bill. You go and fight for your country and you come home, and if you are white, you get a great home loan and all these benefits handed to you, but you have more melanin and you just risked your life for your country. Sorry, no benefits for you. That stuff is evil. And I would say, just on biblical grounds, I could say that's sinful partiality. That is failing to love your neighbor as yourself. But if you listen to these Black scholars, they say critical race theory goes a lot further. Systemic injustice now takes two primary shapes. Number one, abortion being legal since Roe v. Wade, we could talk about Dobbs, but has led to 19 million, by conservative estimates, Black image bearers of God who are not on planet Earth right now, fulfilling Margaret Sanger's racist agenda to, quote, terminate the Negro population. If we have some vision that's supposed to help us spot injustice, and that black light goes right over that massive blood puddle in the middle of the room of 1/3 of the Black population has been exterminated since 1973. And if critical theory or progressivism would just have us shrug our shoulders at that, that's not a compelling vision of justice. And the second main way systemic injustice comes out today is in the very teaching of critical race theory. And I could cite scholars on this, but they have shown, Jason Riley in particular, that when you teach young Black people critical race theory, the system is rigged against you. Racism is endemic to America. The white man is your oppressor. You're in the oppressed group. That leads to negative outcomes for black communities because they throw their hands up in the air and say, why the hell am I going to bother in this white supremacist society? I'll never get ahead. And so there are disparate outcomes racially to the extent that critical race theory is taught to black people, it harms them. And so that's my question. Deconstructing your view is, why are you protecting? Couldn't we say you're just protecting white supremacy by endorsing critical race theory because it has such a disparate negative impact on black communities? And I'll shut up.
I'll tell you what is the greatest, problem for racism is the fact that we've got a Supreme Court that on the basis of a kind of race neutrality, race blindness, has allowed for the gerrymandering of American politics such that the representation of black people in Congress is going to be set back like 100 years. Okay, that is exactly, and that race blindness is exactly the kind of ideology that we need critical race theory to come along and criticize in order to highlight. Because when somebody is saying things like, we need to stop playing the race game, it happens that injustice is racially encoded into our society. And unless we're willing to take seriously and talk about race and that injustice, we will never be able to actually address it.
Wait, so let's just grant that, race blindness in the Supreme Court is racist. That's a greater injustice, like the absence or getting rid of whatever the redistricting. That's more unjust than aborting 19 million black babies.
So look, I want to hop in. I want to hop in here though, because
I was curious. You said that was the greatest injustice of our day, which just happened, by the way.
No, so we're setting up red herrings relative to an argument that really matters, which is when we talk about things like abortion. Notice this is where the postmodernity and critical theory that I tried to lay out at the view that philosophers are taking really seriously is to say, well, what's the context in which abortion could be offered as the example you just gave, Thaddeus? Well, it turns out, as Randall Balmer has shown, the context in which abortion becomes the issue narrated in the way you're narrating is actually a result, very strategically, for workings of power, started in Greenville, South Carolina, where I am, not 7 minutes away from where I'm located, at Bob Jones University. And it had to do with the opposition to integration relative to race. That's why then abortion became the voting issue. I mean, you can laugh, dude, but the data is there.
It's not
because
true,
the early
though.
church documents are clearly
It's not
anti-abortion.
true. The Southern Baptists
Read the early
changed
church on
their
abortion.
view.
Read the early church on abortion. This wasn't some issue that popped up in the 70s.
Didache talks about it.
Yes.
Again,
Of course. Look,
Hold on. I'm pausing. I'm going to be objective here. I'm going to try anyway to be neutral. Everyone's talking a lot.
Possible?
I don't think so. This is a very heated topic, obviously. I think, Thaddeus, make your claim in a minute, and I think Kevin should respond, then we can kind of go from there. Is that fair? Because I think you were going to respond to that,
great.
Thaddeus, and it got loud. So if you could do it like in a minute or so, that'd be great. And then, Kevin, go ahead and respond.
No, I've hogged the mic too much. I'll say very quickly that the assumption that abortion was really made an issue in order to protect, say, white interests or something like that, or to advance a right-wing or Christian nationalist agenda, I think is just utterly absurd when you look at the fact that, like I said, by conservative estimates, 19 million, for every 2 black people you meet, there would be 1 more if it weren't for Roe v. Wade and the greedy abortion industry that's made billions of dollars. You guys have made the point that black bodies matter. I want all of our listeners out there to just visualize, we're talking about bodies terminated from conception. There's a body, however tiny, 19 million of those bodies that have been intentionally terminated, and they're black bodies.
Okay.
If we're going to say I've heard Kevin say, I'm pro-choice, and then to come around and say, well, I appreciate critical theory and critical race theory because it helps expose injustice. And then you wave that black light of critical theory over 19 million dead black image bearers of God, and nothing bothers you, but you're bothered about gerrymandering. I would suggest that is a broken black light that makes ketchup on the wall look like blood and makes blood on the ground look like nothing.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so number one, there's nothing inherent about critical theory that says that you couldn't address abortion. That's just a strange claim. Um, Second, it's just not the case that number one, the the position of evangelical Christianity is just continuous with the position of Christianity as a whole across history. I mean, the history of evangelical Christianity and abortion comes out of a very particular history of Protestantism, which wasn't particularly concerned about abortion. That was a Catholic issue that came into Protestantism. And this is exactly what this should be doing, is making us question these oversimplified narratives that we have. Take Christianity on abortion, for instance. Christianity has an incredibly complex approach to fetal life. For instance, in early Christianity, the argument wasn't that there is that the fetus is alive from the time of conception and thus shouldn't be aborted. The argument that you're making just wasn't the Christian argument. There was an influence from Aristotelian philosophy that had a teleological aim associated with the activity of sex, and there should be no thing that comes and intervenes in the teleology of sex. That is still the position of the Roman Catholic Church, which is exactly why they get rid of like masturbation and like contraception and all the rest of that. So if you don't like get rid of that, then you're not on board with that argument. Then if we have an argument about the status of the fetus and when the fetus becomes a human being, then we get into arguments in early Christianity about ensoulment and when ensoulment occurs. And there we run into arguments about whether it's the case that the male is ensouled at 40 days and the women is ensouled at 80 days. But then, of course, when we come across modern embryology, it just turns out that none of that really makes sense. And so then we have to figure out, okay, what is it that we're going to do? The Catholic Church then makes a decision to backdate the entire thing to conception, but that is hardly a requirement of logic or anything else. And so there is no one Christian position on when life starts. And to project onto the history of Christianity as if there has just been always one position is oversimplifying. It is the kind of thing that allows you to confuse your own present judgment with God's judgment and the judgment of the Christian tradition writ large, which is not true.
Tim, as
Really quick.
moderator here, can I have just a quick,
You
since he was
can,
addressing
but
me?
Corey, do you want to get in on any of this? You've been very quiet, and I'm trying to be very fair. Do you want to respond to any of this at some point?
Well, sure.
After
but I
Thaddeus.
probably took a lot of time at the very beginning.
Okay.
So
Okay. Well, let's get to Thaddeus. Make your
Let me take
response, and
60
then
seconds.
and then I want to move on.
Just to
I'm gonna move
respond,
on.
because Kevin, I appreciate the insight. I appreciate the back and forth. Let me, by way of response, just take the the epistemology or the methodology you guys have been defending and just turn it on itself. So everything you just said, Kevin, I could build a very straightforward critical theory or postmodern style argument to say, let me unmask, let me deconstruct everything you just said by trying to complicate the history of abortion in the Christian church, which you can look unanimously, the early church held to the evil of abortion unanimously across the board. The only reason Kevin is trying to give a counter narrative is to protect his own privilege, is to protect his own power. The only way he's trying to problematize whether a preborn is human is to protect his own politics and protect his own privilege. The fact that he has more size than a preborn, the fact that he's in a different space than a preborn outside the womb, the fact that he has more sophistication neurologically than a preborn, the fact that he's more self-sufficient and doesn't depend on a mother's body, he's protecting all of those privileges by trying to say these preborn humans don't have full human status. So, of course, any argument you give in favor of a pro-choice position can be deconstructed as you're protecting your own size, sophistication, self-sufficiency, privileges. So nothing you say is an objective truth claim about the rights of the preborn. It's purely a veiled power attempt to justify, again, to be clear here, what was 19 million less black image bearers of God. So not only is there your size privilege, there's also a form of white privilege here that you're now justifying what is the single greatest cause of black death in American history. And on top of that, you're using it to justify what is the single greatest cause of death on planet Earth, according to the World Health Organization, with over 70 million. I want our listeners to hear that. 70 million. That's 1/3 of the humans who should have been born last year were terminated by a greedy abortion industry. So you're just running cover for the greedy abortionist and protecting your own privilege. I'm just applying a critical theory or postmodern deconstructionist tactic to everything you just said or could say. Why am I wrong?
I think Kevin has to respond.
I didn't
Then we'll get
make
to
any
Corey.
claim about the morality or immorality of abortion. All I did was point out that the history is more complicated than it's represented by somebody who claims that it's utterly clear and just the Christian position. That just seems strange to me. Nor would I claim that whatever my position on abortion is absolutely certain and certainly correct or independent of my own perspective. Or you're free to make that argument, whatever the position is that I articulate. That, of course, that's okay, because none of us are talking from a God's eye point of view. The whole point is none of us are talking from a God's eye point of view.
I think that the deeper problem, Kevin, is that that's our entire point, is that you're going to deconstruct literally everything. And it's you have no certainty to any beliefs at all. And I don't understand how you can claim to be a Christian. Anyone can claim to be a Christian and say, well, I just don't even know if Jesus rose from the dead. I'm not even saying he did. We can't know that. It's right. We're going to trouble that narrative, and it could be a power play by the clergy, and who knows? What does it even matter?
So let me hop in, Kevin, on this one, because here, Corey, I'm going to try to open this up to Corey, because I want to hear Corey's thought on this. The move that's just been made, right, is, again, the kind of thing that seems to make a lot of sense, but analytic epistemology has been deeply marked over the last 50 years by the movement called Reformed epistemology. Neil, my goodness, I'm looking at you and saying the wrong name. by Nick Wolterstorff, by Al Plantinga, by George Mavrodes, etc. Now, what they all claim is it is possible to know that Jesus is the Son of God. It is possible that we have knowledge of divine truth affairs, of states of affairs that are mind independent. But they're really careful to say, what are the conditions under which that knowledge is possible? It's an externalist verificationism by which we have no access. So their whole point is, we don't know that we know. And I'm Pentecostal, so we do the whole I know that I know that I know stuff, which is actually a doubling down on, look, I recognize this is not something that is likely translatable into publicly consumable objective states of affairs, but it's the experience and the journey that I have lived. I know that I know that I know. I'm anchored here. I am wedded to this. When Nick Wolterstorff describes the difference between control beliefs and data beliefs, what he does is says what counts as evidence will itself depend to some degree on the assumptions from which you start. And those assumptions from which you start are challengeable in light of the increasing data beliefs that eventually become tensions and objectors and defeaters to what you claimed to start with in the first place. So what you're objecting to, Neil, is not, and Corey, I would say the same account relative to but there has to be an objective thing, and truth is just there and its correspondence. I'm sympathetic to a lot of that, but all that Kevin and I have suggested as philosophers defending these methodologies is Reformed epistemology itself, the most influential Christian epistemic vision of the past 50 years, is a postmodern perspective. And it is radically self-interrogatory, it is self-reflexive, and it is radically revisable. They do not claim certainty. Plantinga is explicit about this. Wolterstorff goes as far as to make very clear
Aaron, let's land the plane
back
soon,
and
so we can get to
forth.
Corey.
So I'll stop there, Corey. What's been refuted, if Neil's refuted anything, and Corey, I think you the same way, is the very tradition of Christian thinking upon which you're likely to draw.
Yeah, I mean, for Plantinga's externalism, for example, in his Reformed epistemology, he says it's that quantity or quality of which, together with true belief, constitutes knowledge. So he's going to reject hard foundationalism of the modernist period. I don't know that I would want to say, I don't know that I would want to project on him and say, you're a postmodernist.
Yeah.
Now, he's more of a pre-modernist. In fact, he
Yes.
says this is the AC model. It's the Aquinas-Calvin model that I was referring to earlier from Aquinas, Aristotle, and that whole connection. So, but that's I'm glad we're going here though, because I still had some questions open earlier. I've noticed, and we always do this, and sometimes we're inconsistent with our own beliefs, but it's really hard to nail down this Heraclitean fish that is postmodernism. Because Aaron might have one particular view, Kevin another one, and I don't know that it really represents the postmodernism and critical theory that we're asking the question of. Is it helpful or a hindrance for Christians to create a better world? So, as we know, Christianity is taken internally to be a knowledge tradition, as I was getting at earlier. Postmodernism, on almost all counts, at least with respect to the grand meta narrative. And Aaron, you sort of balked when I said, creation, corruption, redemption, restoration. You take one of those words out, throw another one in, whatever. But it's the whole thing of where we came from, where we're going. We're situating everything within the grand story. That grand story at least unifies all the postmodernists on rejecting it. That's what I'm still at odds with, trying to figure out how any Christian wants to claim that a methodology lines up at the line for the hike, Christianity a knowledge tradition, and postmodernism, critical theory, a subversion to knowledge. Where do we draw the line? You can believe in creation. Okay. Can you believe in redemption? Can you believe in the crucifixion? Can Tim be objective like a moment ago? Can we look at James Cone and say, oh no, let me tell you what the authorial intent here is. Let me step out of my postmodern shoes and say, I can know the author's intent. And I can know context.
I just think the way you're describing,
you need postmodernism or critical theory when Christianity, yes, it's had foul ups, it's had bad representatives, it
currently
has
them,
sinners, which is why Jesus came, right? But when you look at it on the whole, I'm still not convinced there is anything that a system that is subversive to knowledge, when the central purpose in life, according to Jesus, includes knowledge, is going to be helpful rather than harmful, except in mild ways that, let's be reminded here of epistemic humility. I can go with that, but I don't need critical theory or postmodernism to do that. When I look at the fruit of the root of Christendom, I can start to see why now you're getting people like Richard Dawkins, of all people, now wanting to write his case on the divine spy camera theory that, okay, Christians are good people. They can be good people, but only because they believe God is watching them, right? Or that he wants to claim to be a cultural Christian, because Now he wants the fruit of Christendom when he compares it to Marxism or Islamism in his view, but he thinks he can always get the fruit from the grocery store without getting it from the root of where it came from. When we look at what Christendom has done because of a knowledge system, and beginning with mind rather than matter, it's no accident why we created the universities, why we created the hospitals starting in the 4th century, why I look at Harvard professor Arthur Brooks that I just pulled out when we're talking about generosity now. Who really cares? America's charity divide, who gives, who doesn't, and why it matters. He was a liberal. He's at Harvard. He's been a professor of philanthropy for 40 years. He says in here, there is no measurable way, and he's got a ton of data, and he's looking at Canada, Europe, America, 40 years of research, no measurable way in which secularists in general outbeat in generosity religious conservatives. And he says, similarly, but better than secularists, are progressives that are religious. Why? Because beliefs precede behavior, and beliefs that have confidence that are much more likely to act upon it. I'm not going to be generous on a view that I'm at 51%. But if I can know the Bible without having to be black or woman or transgender or whatever, if I can know it as a white guy and I can understand it adequately and I can acquire the convictions that the text intended, well, then I might do something about it. And in fact, that's what we've seen in history. I don't know how critical theory or postmodernism, which lines up at the, at the 1 yard line, and it's got a stance of skepticism, advances that at all. It seems to, it's still problematic. People are still sinners, but it's a knowledge tradition.
All right. So thank you, Corey, for those insights. A lot there to ponder. We have not heard very much from the thought leader of progressive Christianity. That is Tim Whitaker. So Tim, man, let's hear it. What do you got?
If I'm a thought leader in progressive Christianity, it's in trouble. But no, this is honestly, anyone can answer this, but I was thinking Corey kind of sparked the question. And it's honestly, it's something that I say a lot on my content, and part of kind of why I quote unquote, deconstructed evangelical theology at some point with how I understood it. You made the comment of something to the effect, Corey, of, you can read the Bible, know the intent of it. It's a knowledge, Christianity is a knowledge tradition, right? Something like that. Sure. I'm not the best characterizer, but something to that effect, right? Of we can read the Bible, we can know what they meant, we can get kind of like a pretty clear understanding of what it is and isn't.
The main things are the plain things, and the plain things are the main things.
Yes.
There is variation, yes.
Right. Well, my question is that, and not just how do you know, but I just find that almost, because I know that a big thing in at least the apologetics space, like I've talked to Sean McDowell, is the probability certainty, right? Like how certain can we be? I just find the idea of relying on a very complicated, first off, just tradition of how we got the modern English Protestant Bible, not including the Catholic canon or the Eastern Orthodox canon, this idea that we can just read it and that we can find, the major agreements when we have major schisms that disagree. Soteriology, I think about one easy one. Forget Catholicism, Eastern Orthodox, and Protestantism. You can look inside of the Protestant tradition, right? You can look at Calvinists like James White, who will tell you that no, it's tulip all the way, right? And then at the same time, more charismatic Pentecostal traditions are like, no, you have to make the choice. That's a big separation of how one is or isn't saved. And then you get into how one becomes saved. Is it praying the prayer, walking down the aisle, and just praying a short, easy, hey, I'm a sinner, I admit it. This is something that maybe Greg Laurie would do with his Harvest Crusades, or really Billy Graham, popularized. Is it what Paul Washer says, where no, that's just almost like, supernatural witchcraft. You have to actually commit to giving your life to Christ, and it usually aligns with these particular, either culture war issues, etc. Ali Stuckey would say that you can't be pro-choice and be a Christian. I mean, she said that. So my question is how do you know, with a good level of certainty, that what you're claiming around how you understand the Bible, how you understand salvation, is actually the way compared to the not just several, like infinite possibilities of how someone understands the faith. And I think that's what I would say when it comes to, maybe even James Cone is like, that's why I find it very palpable of like, right, we all bring our own experience to the text. When I read the Bible, I'm reading it shaped by a particular way. That seems very reasonable to me. So I would just love to kind of hear, anyone can answer this, but I'd love to hear, Corey, you kind of sparked that question, what you think about that.
So I think going back to Augustine, in essentials unity, in non-essentials liberty, in all things charity, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the essentials are very small. Who is God? How does man get to heaven? Both of which find their segue in the person and work of Christ. I don't think you're going to find, as much as they like to be dogmatic, a White or Stuckey or whoever you just mentioned, or Greg Laurie, Calvary Chapel at the other end, right? They'll be dogmatic on certain things, but if you pushed them and challenged them, they're going to say, no, this is a denomination. Kevin belongs to a denominational school, Methodist, right? It's got a common denominator. So none of those, let's say the Protestant ones, because you brought up that in particular, apart from the Catholic Protestant, none of those Protestant ones are going to say that we disagree on the essentials right there. You would say, my old ghost, Mormonism, yes, that one would, because again, the main things are the plain things and the plain things are the main things. And you might say, well, it's not that plain. If it were plain, then 100% of the people would get it. And I would say, look, there are people out there. Kevin just wrote a book on, the book that Neil was quoting. You've got other ones like Lynn Tonstad. You've got people that self-identify as being Black when they're white. You've got people who think they're Julius Caesar. If I'm looking for consensus on anything, as a trained philosopher, man, give it up. The only things you even get close to on certainty is maybe logic, introspective philosophy, and mathematics. Everything, and I mean everything else, is a complex between faith plus reason, belief plus evidence. Everything.
Sure. Yeah.
And so there is the question on everything from the grass is green to whether I think this airplane is going to reliably get me to the other side, is a question about my understanding or intuition of reasonable faith on that.
Right.
And so I
Right.
would say on the
Yeah.
essentials,
Sure.
and I think the Catholics and the Protestants even, they're going to debate it and they're going to say that Protestants are wrong. Protestants are going to say that Catholics are wrong. If it's a contradiction, going back to the law of non-contradiction, it's correct. Both can't be true.
Well, that's kind of, and just a follow up, and then I'll end it here. But that's kind of my point is like, how do you know what you're claiming is based in that kind of certainty, right? Because you're right, the Catholics and Protestants are going to disagree. But like I said earlier, Ali Stuckey would say, I have her tweet, you can't be a pro-choice and be a Christian. That's pretty essential. I mean, that is salvific. That is not a minor thing. You have the oneness tradition, right? That wouldn't affirm the Trinity. I think that it's a little more complicated, in my opinion, over, how you measure who is saved. Even the idea of what you said about getting to heaven. N.T. Wright would argue it's about life after death. It's about a new earth. Heaven isn't even the main claim of what the New Testament is talking about, right? So these are not, in my opinion, hey, do we have drums in church or not? Which I grew up, my church had a whole church split. These are like major questions of potentially eternal destiny. And it seems like in the Christian tradition, we can't get any kind of major consensus. Even the significance of the death and resurrection of Jesus is very different among different traditions, depending on which atonement theory you would subscribe to, right? So I'm not trying to get you into a corner. I'm just really curious because this is kind of why I walked away from the apologetics move of like, you can have certainty, or you can know where you're going to go when you die, or the Bible is the infallible, inerrant word of God. Here we have it. I just looked around. I mean, this is just me looking around the landscape of Christianity and going, I don't know, guys. Like, it seems a little way more complicated than that, and we can't get any kind of major agreement, even on some major issues.
Yeah. If I could just speak briefly to that, I mean, think of flat earthers, right? There's people out there who there's certain views on reality that are clearly just out of bounds if you take evidence seriously. And I would say if somebody comes along, like Benny Hinn is one of these televangelist types, just a total con man with a comb over who's been swindling people out of their inheritances for longer than I've been alive. he had some word of faith, some divine revelation years ago, where he said, "I reject the Trinity. I believe in the nanity. There's 9 persons in God." Now here's where theology. I'm a theologian. That's my training. That's my specialty. Uh, and I tell my students every semester that if somebody charged into the classroom and said, "Hey, I was just over in the science lab and water is H3O," like, we could test that. It's not like anything goes, all interpretations are equally valid. You can test the claim, you can go count the hydrogen and oxygen and falsify their position. And I would say theology is also a knowledge discipline, to Corey's point, and Christianity is a knowledge tradition, where if somebody charges into my classroom and says, like Benny Hinn, no, you guys have had it wrong. The Trinity's 9 parts. I could go to the text of Scripture, and without having an exhaustive, complete God's eye view interpretation of it, even coming short of divine omniscience, I can still falsify nanityism that God is 9 parts.
But you can't.
You
can't do that.
No, you
And
can't.
I mean, this will be my last thing, and I'll stop hogging the mic. I think that this is the category error: is that you're taking, like, the flat Earth. We can measure beyond other humans that the Earth is not flat. We can do the calculations. We can do the math. You're relying on, first off, the English Protestant Bible and what you think it says, but it's not clear about the Trinity. I'm
not relying on the English Bible.
That's what you said. You would go to the Bible and falsify it. I'm
not
assuming
the
you go to the
Bible.
English.
I'm a theologian.
Okay, so what Bible are you going to go to?
To the Greek Bible that has been pulled together by textual critics who have
with all different manuscripts that have been assembled over 1,000+ years. Right, it's a complicated collection, but even that point doesn't matter. You're still relying on how you interpret the text. Right, the Trinity comes along after the Christian tradition, like several, I think, 100 years after the Christian tradition. If I'm not mistaken, it's developed later. So theology is not science. I think that is a major category mistake, in my opinion. I'm all done. Thank you.
I would even go as far and say science is not science in what we normally mean by science, right? So, Corey, to your point, to say that Christianity is a knowledge tradition, I would simply put a lot more emphasis on tradition and say, yes, Christianity is a tradition that has articulated an account of knowledge and then filled in a whole bunch of things that it claims then to be stable and settled. I fully affirm the importance of any historical community taking seriously where it stands, making that as clear as possible so that others can decide whether or not to stand with that group or oppose it. So I'm entirely fine with saying, here is what this church claims to be the case, or this is what this tradition claims to be the case, or this is what we claim Christianity is or amounts to. I have no objection to the historical practice of doing that. All any of us have tried to suggest is when we talk about postmodernism, it's not subversive of knowledge. It is a suspicion that when we claim these knowledge communities, we tend to forget their historical traditionness. And that's the whole point. And so this is part of why it can be frustrating, I think. I'm sure y'all are just as frustrated, if not, utterly repulsed by the fact that we're being obtuse. And yet it's not. It's to say we're working not at 2 different levels and one's better, one's worse, but we're working within 2 different traditions. And the idea of saying the tradition that takes postmodernity seriously is antithetical to Christianity assumes a very particular account of Christianity. Postmodernism is simply the methodology that says, yeah, and it might be right. It might be the thing we all should affirm. But whatever arguments one gives for that, what other evidence one offers for that, and we welcome and get excited about that conversation, because if I'm wrong, I'd love to be changed from my wrongness to rightness. That shift is not something that somehow easily gets us to certainty about how propositions, correspond to states of affairs. No philosopher understands what correspondence means. What we do is saying of what is the case that it's the case is exactly the task. We're doing the best we can at that. And if we're going to do that, we probably should be interdisciplinarily open. We should be humble about the biases that operate. We should radically invite and be self-critical. That move is not subversive of the knowledge tradition of Christianity. It's doing precisely what Kierkegaard articulates when he says Christianity must be brought back to Christendom. It's what Bonhoeffer means when he calls for a religionless Christianity and says, in fact, the only people I can't talk about God around are Christians, because they all think that God is so stable, so secure, so understood. We can't do the work of Christianity, which is being ruptured by reverence to that which would outstrip our knowledge claims. So I agree with what you said,
time,
Corey.
Just so we know.
I just think maybe it should be nuanced on that front.
All right, that's helpful. Let me propose this as we wind down here. So we got about 12 minutes to a hard out. There's 6 of us, so maybe 2-minute closing statements all around, sort of reflections, final thoughts. And let me just say, this is the beginning of hopefully an ongoing conversation. The goal I clarified with everybody going into this, the win would be people would get out of our silos and our echo chambers and have more conversations like this. I hope for all the listeners out there, you're like, oh, cool. Oh, I never thought about it that way. I've never seen it that way. So obviously we didn't solve everything in this single back and forth. I think it's been super edifying, and I've learned a lot from the other side. But I want to kick it to...
Can Aaron go first since he has a hard out? He's the one with the hard out, I think, out of quote.
Yeah, Aaron, give us like 2 minutes. And then
2 minutes, Aaron. I'm going to time you.
Time it.
I'm going to time you.
You don't want to go.
On your marks, get set.
See, I'm
go.
fair. I'm balanced.
So I would just start by saying thank you all for being here. Neil, Corey, Thaddeus, I appreciate your time and the work that you put in thinking through difficult issues that are worth taking time to put in, right? I hope that listeners would take away from this conversation an awareness that there are people who use the moniker postmodern or critical theory or critical race theory or queer theory or whatever it is in ways that are deeply problematic and worthy of serious critique, not just from Christian traditions, but from within critical race theory and from within queer theory and postmodernity. And by looking at those traditions, what you will find is precisely that. And that's the thing I think that tends to get lost in the work of folks like you, is it becomes a hegemonic account that stands opposed as a metaphysic, as a worldview. And those are precisely, I think, misnomers. The traditions are more complicated, even internal to themselves. When we appreciate that, we can see these methodologies as resources because they help us understand that we do the exact same thing internal to Christianity. Christianity is more complicated. It is more nuanced, and it is more robustly nested in lived traditions. And that's what makes it miraculously compelling in all sorts of ways. So I don't think that the opposition is some sort of total rejection of the other. It's an attempt to say, I think when the other sets up binaries that are themselves worthy of challenging, we should be receptive to that. And I see postmodernism do that really, really well, even internal to my Christianity.
Wow, what time to spare. Nice work.
Well said, brother. Thank you. Who wants to go next? Neil, Corey?
I can go, sure. Time myself too. Okay, so I think the big thing to recognize is that everyone lives with confidence. We all live as if we're confident in certain things, whether it's the fruit of the spirit, justice, sexual morality. We pick something, we're like, I'm living this out. I'm going to go out there and yell at people who disagree with me. I'm going to stand for my beliefs. We have confidence. But that doesn't make sense if you deep down aren't actually confident that anything you believe is true. So postmodernist critical theorists will always, if you push them, will say, I can't know what's really true, and they'll trouble certainties and say, you can't know that there are only 2 genders. You can't know that this system is just. You can't know that. You can't know whether the fetus is alive. But at the end of the day, they're living with exactly the confidence they deny that you have. So Kevin, I think you asked me, how can you claim to have a more objective, rational stance on other people? And I say, I can't know that relative to everybody. But when I see people who are obviously living inconsistently, when they're claiming doubt and skepticism and uncertainty, just like atheists do, and yet living a very confident life from a particular political perspective, I can say, look, I'm actually being consistent with my confidence in reality, and you're being inconsistent with your skepticism. I think that's where I would start. It's like, and Tim, to your question, as a Christian, I would start, I wouldn't start with the Bible, actually. I start with Jesus, a person that you encounter. Call me an externalist and a Reformed epistemologist, but yeah, I encounter Christ spiritually. But then I discovered that he's an actual person who lived a real historical life, and he did actually think Scripture was the Word of God very clearly as a Jewish rabbi, unsurprisingly. So I go from that to saying, well, what does that mean about Scripture? And I begin to follow Scripture and believe and experience it as the Word of God, which is what gives me confidence. I think you can get there. I've written a whole book on it. But I would push on this contrast. When people deny certainty, they exemplify it in their lives, and that's not consistent, which is why I'm calling into question this very framework they're using.
Awesome. Thank you, Neil.
Kevin,
Kevin, you want to go next?
Yeah, I'll go. I didn't question whether people could be confident. I questioned whether people could be certain. That's a significant difference between those two. Uh, I would just say, in the end, Aaron and I are not advocating for relativism in any way. We are very much in the school of like Reformed epistemology. We believe that people can be justified internal to particular communities. I'm an epistemic contextualist. I believe that your justification and your knowledge claims are relative to who you're having a conversation with and exactly what the objections are that you're facing at any particular time. This just requires a subtle epistemology, and the fact that we recognize that we can't be certain about things doesn't mean that we don't make knowledge claims, doesn't mean that we don't do any of that. And so there's no inconsistency involved in this. That just seems to be read into our position. I would say that for those who have been talking about Christianity as a knowledge tradition, I would encourage you to read William Abraham's Canon and Criterion, which is about how the early church established first canons, lists of things that you had to agree to in order to be part of the Christian community, and how those eventually were converted into epistemic criteria, which then gave rise to foundationalism, the claim that the agreement with the council gave you epistemic security, and then eventually, if you agreed with the Pope, that gave you epistemic security, and then the Protestants come along and say, if you agree with the Bible, that gives you epistemic security, which is just a whole history of Christian kind of epistemology that's all collapsing on itself the entire time, which is just another level of this, the idea that we ought to be critical about our own history and where we're coming from, because we're all doing stuff from particular perspectives.
Thank you.
Well said. Corey, the floor is yours, man. 2 minutes.
Sure. My take on this is, and first of all, I appreciate everyone bringing it, and it's been fun to engage with you and get to know you a little bit more too, and your background and biking and all of that kind of stuff. A couple of years ago, I went on a speaking tour with Peter Boghossian, whose book was endorsed by Richard Dawkins. He was a new atheist. And we went and toured several universities. I remember in one in Utah, they tried to cancel us and called us logical fascists, simply because we were giving a lecture on viewpoint diversity, the death of intellectual diversity in the universities. What has come into eyesight to, you might call them modernists and pre-modernists, into even the new atheists, is that the postmodern critical theorist position has given rise to illiberalism. It's not just, I think, not helpful to Christianity. It's not helpful to academics. Most of the cancel culture is coming from that wing, and it's not from the liberals. It's the new left and so forth. And I think there are questions about this whole suspicion and the questioning about people's motives, that truth is really akin to power, like Foucault and so forth. I think that's not helpful at all. It divides. Critical theory divides. It doesn't unite. But here's coming back to my football analogy coming online. One author says, again, 6 different authors, 6,000 different opinions on it. Same thing Tim had a problem with interpreting the Bible. We can't interpret James Cone or postmodernism, but one says characterized by a broad skepticism, subjectivism, or relativism. Doesn't have to be radical. And I've heard Aaron say that several times, and I get that, right? And that's why I wanted to know, where do you arbitrarily draw the line between the meta-narrative and small fry issues? A general suspicion of reason and an acute sensitivity to the role of ideology in asserting and maintaining political and economic power. That seems to be a pretty good description of it anyway. And then I guess I would just close with one quote from someone who would be the godfather of postmodern practical theology within evangelicalism. It's Brian McLaren. And in his book, The Church on the Other Side, he says postmodernism is the intellectual boundary between old world and the other side. Why is it so important? Because when your view of truth is changed, which it has, when your confidence in the human ability to know truth in any objective way is revolutionized, then everything changes. That includes theology, but I would say it includes James Cone and the stop signs when you're driving as well. I think it's just inconsistent to get up to the line with a knowledge tradition and try to buddy up with a tradition that, in Tim's world, I don't know that he could take confidence in anything that the Bible says. And if so, I would be interested in what he thinks he could and why.
I guess that
All
brings
right.
it to me.
Tim,
So,
your turn.
I'm going to kind
2
of
minutes.
just say what I wanted to say. That it's relevant, but not. But we should do a part 2 because we didn't talk about MAGA or Christian nationalism, which I think actually embodies Corey's idea of postmodernism to a T. The idea of things always changing, definitions, moral truth changing. It's really wild to watch Franklin Graham in 1996 say that what Bill Clinton does in his private life really matters for public policy. And then, a couple months ago, he's praying over Trump's second inauguration saying, look at what God has done. And I just think that's, for me, I don't really have a dog in the fight necessarily. This is not my lane. I don't do this kind of work, as a content curator. But regardless of what we think about critical theory or whatever else, in my opinion, Christian nationalism is infinitely more dangerous right now. It's happening in our country. And unfortunately, it's white evangelicalism statistically that is the biggest arbiter of these ideas. So, my big point here is that I guess we could talk about how critical race theory is destroying everything. Although, again, Christopher Rufo was very clear that he intentionally made that a talking point to make everything that sounded racist or race-based automatically CRT, which makes it sound woke. It's a whole thing. To me, it's cool. I enjoyed the conversation, but it just is really interesting that we didn't talk on, I think, what is really destroying the country. And speaking of dividing people, I can't think of any more movement more based on division than MAGA. The fact that we have a president who literally said that his election was stolen from him, even though objectively speaking we knew it wasn't, and then to watch white evangelicals, some still today, say, yep, that's my guy, as he posts pictures of himself being depicted as Jesus and says things like we should, kill Democrats for seditious behavior, punishable by death, because they said you don't have to follow lawful commands. That kind of stuff to me, it's kind of wild that this is the conversations that so many people in this space are having when the 5-alarm fire is, in my opinion, not coming from whatever we think critical race theory is. It's coming from the people that 80% of white evangelicals have voted for 2016, 2020, 2024, and despite being best friends with the pedophile, I know it's a big deal for Thaddeus, most white evangelicals still overwhelmingly support this man. So to me, that's the much bigger issue that I would love to get into for a part 2.
Awesome. Yeah. So just to clarify Tim's comment, why that's a big deal for me, I've done some content on how the history of pedophilia in gender theory, which I'll link in the comments. But let me just say to all the dudes involved, thank you. I'm so grateful for this. I got a lot. I actually learned a lot. Yeah. Kevin, thank you. Aaron, thank you. Tim, thank you. I wish we heard more from Tim. Sorry, we kind of hogged the mic from you for a lot of it,
Fine.
but appreciate your
All
input
good.
too. Couple just closing thoughts. So number one, this didn't really come out in the conversation, but Aaron has stellar taste in music. That could be a topic for a whole nother show. We'll go there.
I'm
number
entirely
two,
fine to do that part 3. Yes.
yeah,
sounds good to me.
that can be part 3. Number 2, Tim saying, hey, maybe a part 2's in order. I'm on board. Like I said, more of this. And I think hopefully our listeners can resonate with that. More of this. I recognize like confirmation bias and the power of our algorithms. Like Tim, one of the reasons I've enjoyed being buddies with you online is because you're at a different algorithm. And so you post stuff that typically I just don't see, like when Palestinian, like the whole Gaza thing. I remember seeing friends with different algorithms like, are you not seeing the footage of Palestinian children? And I was like, not really. And so that cross pollination of seeing the stuff that if we want to love God with our minds, we want to be exposed to more information, not less. We want to hear from other sides, not less. And so, hey, I'm just really grateful for all you guys. Closing thoughts on, it's my channel, so I can take as long as I want. I can hold you all hostage for the next half hour.
That's true.
But if you just quick closing thoughts. Number one, if I'm hearing how postmodernism and critical theory are being employed here, I think one of the running themes, and this is going to Kevin's point, that what he's against is certainty. And I respect that for a lot of reasons. Let me just connect a couple dots that a few light bulbs that turned on for me during the conversation. One of them is, we got into the question of, are the preborn lives worth living or lives unworth living? Lebensunwerten und Leben was the Nazi term for it. These are lives unworth living. And I was trying to say, look, any pro-choice position can be criticized as protecting our own privilege over and against all these 19 million black image bearers exterminated, over 70 million exterminated in the last year. So here's my one thought on that was sort of a genuine epiphany during our back and forth was, if uncertainty is the name of the game, then uncertainty, it seems to me, would justify a pro-life conservative position. And let me just state the case in like 60 seconds, is if we decide, hey, the six of us had a good back and forth, that was fun. Let's all go on a hunting trip. Aaron, you're a big outdoorsy guy. I don't know if you hunt or not, but let's pretend we all go hunting and we're out there, we're looking for quail or I don't know, whatever. And I hear a rustling in the bushes and I have uncertainty. Is that Neil in the bushes? Is that Kevin in the bushes? I don't know. I'm uncertain. I can't make any affirmative certain claims about what's in the bushes. It could be a quail. It could be a progressive Christian. I don't know. Ethically, it seems like I would be committed to not pulling the trigger. So if we're uncertain about metaphysical claims, including, say, the metaphysical status of the preborn, then not knowing with certainty whether it's a human being would justify not pulling the trigger, and therefore a pro-life, not a pro-choice position where you run the risk, given your uncertainty, of wiping out 19 million black bodies. So that's one thought. And then closing thought here. I think that at the end of the day, the case we've been trying to build, Neil and Corey and I, is there's a deep sense in which deconstructionism deconstructs itself, in which any response, I open by sharing the stories of some of my friends with more melanin, and I think any response to them saying postmodernism and critical theory are wrong, it seems like by the standards of critical theory and postmodernity, we'd have to say, okay, we take your word for it. The minute some white guy steps in and tries to reframe or reconcile their lived experiences with critical theory or postmodernism is the minute critical theory and postmodernism eats itself, and we could just come back with the retort, well, you're just hiding your power play for your own white privilege. So obviously there's much more that could be said, but hey, gentlemen, I really, really appreciate you. I'm happy to do round two if you guys are, but everybody here, you took time out of your busy day. You got families. Aaron has an anniversary to celebrate. Neil just celebrated an anniversary. We're all real dudes. We aren't just talking heads on a screen with real lives and all that stuff. So, hey, nothing but love to you fellas. And let's do it again sometime.